Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 386 part 2. It is of course Patreon Drydock, so plenty more questions to be answered, and we're going to start immediately. Ian Carr asks, were the changes made to the last World War II Town class cruisers considered from the point of the earliest ones as they were designed, or was this progressive evolution? Not exactly, because, well, Belfast and Edinburgh are over the treaty limits, whereas the first set, the Southamptons, were actually about 1,000 tons under the treaty limits. And that was partly because the British were playing things very conservatively. A fair number of British ships finished underweight during the interwar period. But also because there was some working theory of essentially trying to eke additional cruisers out, especially if you're doing a big production run. So, for example, if your limit is 10,000 tons, well, you can build 10 cruisers for 100,000 tons of displacement. But if you somehow manage to fit that all in 9,000 tons, then of course your 10 cruisers will only weigh 90,000 tons, which means you can get an 11th cruiser, and you've spent 99,000 tons. And the Royal Navy was really trying to get as many cruisers as it humanly could. The only reason they were even going close to the 10,000 ton limit was because with the advent of things like the Megamis and the Brooklyns, it was very clear that Leanders and Arethusas weren't really going to cut it in the face of full-fledged 10,000-ton 6-inch cruisers. And then, of course, they went through and iterated from the Southamptons. Then the next subclass, if you like, were improved because they had weight to spare. And then eventually you end up with Belfast and Edinburgh, where you go over the weight limit because, well, the treaty systems collapse, so you might as well. But one of the rather interesting things which you see in the last towns, the Belfast and Edinburgh, is going from 4 4-inch guns per side for anti-aircraft work to 6. And what might not be appreciated is that for a while in the very earliest concepts of the Town class, they also thought that maybe having 6 4-inch guns per side for AA work would work, although in a slightly different layout. So on most of the towns, you had 4 twin 4-inch mounts, 2 on each side. Belfast and Edinburgh, you have 6 twin 4-inch mounts, 3 on each side. But some of the very earliest design sketches for the Town class give you a 6-gun broadside without actually having to use 6 twin mounts. And they did that by having 2 mounts on either side, and then 1 mount super firing to a certain extent, although it wasn't directly super firing over the aft super firing triple 6-inch turret, but it was on the platform where the main mast is. And then when they decided, okay, maybe we can't afford 5 twin 4-inch, although once it became clear they were coming out 9,000 tons instead of 10,000, you probably could have done. But when they dropped that idea, for a while, the 4 guns on either side for anti-aircraft work was actually met by having 2 twin mounts, 1 on each side, and then keeping that platform mount. So you only had 3 twin mounts, but of course you could bring 4 guns to bear on either side because of the centerline capabilities of that 3rd twin mount. And one thing also that was in the initial Town class concept and actually survived a fair way into design option consideration, which would have been interesting to see in the end, but didn't come about, was actually the idea for these cruisers to effectively be almost micro carriers, because eventually, on paper, the Town class could operate 3 walruses, but for a good chunk of their design process, when they're considering options, they were actually designed to take in peacetime 3 TSR, or Torpedo Strike Reconnaissance Aircraft, and in wartime 5 TSR. The TSR program would eventually become the Swordfish, so these would have been float plane Swordfish, and the explicit idea of that was essentially that, well, we can't have that many carriers because they're limited by treaty. So if each of our new light cruisers can take 5, admittedly very slow at that point, torpedo bombers, then if they're operating in a cruiser squadron, let's say 4 ships, that means that these 4 ships, despite not having a single flight deck between them, can put 20 torpedo bombers up into the air, which is actually quite a terrifying concept. But that didn't survive. It got downrated to 3 TSR, and then the TSR requirement was switched over to Walrus, and very rarely did a Town class actually carry 3 walrus in World War II. But it is somewhat amusing to think of if the Royal Navy had really gone ham on churning out the Town class and they'd all been equipped with 5 torpedo bombers, just what shenanigans they would have gotten up to. DM Phoenix asks, on the Grim Reaper's Tirpitz versus Vanguard video, you had mentioned that only an elite few could use a stereoscopic rangefinder compared to the more user-friendly coincidence rangefinder. What is the major design difference between these two types of rangefinders that renders one more complicated to use than the other? Did radar make both obsolete, or was there some combined usage? So dealing with the latter part first, radar didn't make the optical rangefinder obsolete overnight. For one thing, generally, especially early on in the war, if you were using radar for range finding, early war radars could give you a decent range approximation, but actually not as precise a one as the optical systems could give you. It's just it could give you one more reliably, night, rain, etc., etc. And then even as time went on, even when you had proper fire control radar, again, initially, once those systems started to come into play, you would have only one system. So if that radar was slightly misaligned or people weren't reading it right, then you would get an incorrect result. Whereas optical rangefinders, there were usually multiple of them. So if you were sensible, you could either average the results or look at the various results that are being spat out and go, okay, that one's clearly an outlier. That one isn't arranged correctly. And of course, radar is a form of electronic emission, so once people started getting things like radar warning receivers, then if you could sneak up on somebody and sight them with your optical systems, and they were relying heavily on electronic countermeasures and electronic warfare to figure out if there was somebody out there, obviously that gave you a stealth advantage. So there was quite a bit of combined optical and radar use during World War II. But as you get beyond World War II and the era of guns starts to give way more to aircraft and missiles, then most of the optical rangefinders tend to go away. Now, looping back to the difference between the coincidence and the stereoscopic, so I did do a video on rangefinders, but very briefly and sort of as a kind of an overall, the coincidence rangefinder works very much like, in some ways, the focus on some old-school 35mm film cameras used to. I've still got an old 35mm Olympus film camera that works on exactly this principle. And the idea is, with a coincidence rangefinder, that you have a circular view, and the top half of the view is from one lens, and the bottom half of the view is from the other lens. And so what you need to do is then make adjustments to the rangefinder to try and bring the two halves of that image in line. So it will be split exactly. So the idea is then, obviously, if you're looking at an enemy ship and you put that center line, say, halfway up the hull, and then you look at the front and there's a zigzag shape to the bow, as you know, okay, right, it's not in alignment, adjust the dial slightly. And as the two pictures slide together, when you now have a coherent whole picture that doesn't have an obvious split line on it, now you are at the correct range. And then someone can read off the rangefinder and say, well, this is the range to the target. So the main problem you have there is you have to try and make sure that the two images are aligned correctly. But your brain is always registering there are two images. It's not a particularly great stress mentally from that perspective. Whereas with the stereoscopic type rangefinder, you have two full images overlaid on top of each other, as opposed to one separate from the other. And what you have to do is similarly adjust the lenses and prisms, because you're still getting one image from one end and one image from the other end of your rangefinder. But in this case, what you're trying to do is actually to get those two images to overlap. And when they overlap, then of course the image becomes nice and clear, and that tells you now you have the two images in alignment, or the two lenses in alignment, and therefore you can read off the appropriate range. Now, the reason why you only have an elite few that can use a stereoscopic rangefinder for any given time is that, one, you need people with absolute perfect vision, because if you've got very slightly off from perfect vision, you can still use a coincidence rangefinder pretty well, because you can line up details in big shapes, and very slight blurs don't make too much odds in the grand scheme of things, especially when you've got colour that you can line up as well. Whereas if you have even the slightest bit of blur in your vision, and you're using a stereoscopic rangefinder, you won't necessarily be able to tell whether the blur you're looking at is because you haven't actually quite overlaid the images perfectly, and therefore you're out of distance and out of focus, or whether it's just your eyes being bad and you actually have it in focus. So you're quite potentially then going to give incorrect range readings. And the other problem, of course, is that your eyes are designed to take two separate images and overlay them into a single image. Basically, with the stereoscopic rangefinder, what it's doing is exactly the same thing your eyes naturally do to estimate range to something. It's effectively putting your eyes much, much further apart, so you get a greater angle of incidence, and therefore you can estimate range at longer distances. The problem there, of course, is that your eyes, if you look at something, generally speaking, assuming your eyes are working properly, will focus on that thing pretty darn quickly and naturally. Whereas in the case of a stereoscopic rangefinder, it's manually adjusting that you have to do. And that means your brain is looking at two overlapping images, which are functionally identical, and your brain is going, okay, I just need to adjust the focus of the eyeballs, and these will resolve into a clear and coherent image. And then that doesn't happen because it's not your eyes focus that's the problem, it's the rangefinders. And your brains basically start screaming about this, and it takes a fair amount of mental fortitude to go essentially consciously tell your brain, no, we have to dial this in. But during that time, it is causing strain mentally and to your eyes because your brain is automatically trying to adjust things. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar to if somebody you know has a really heavy glasses prescription and your sight is fine and you put their glasses on and you look around, very soon you'll start to get a headache or tension in your eyes or your forehead or something like that. That is what a stereoscopic rangefinder operator will experience sooner or later. It's not a case of you won't, it's just a case of how long can you endure, how good is your mental discipline, and basically how plastic is your brain when you're basically essentially doing a manual override on it. And so when it comes to stereoscopic rangefinders, you have to have somebody who has both absolute 20/20 vision and the right kind of mindset and mental layout to be able to handle the stereoscopic rangefinder for a long period of time. And as I say, even then, they are going to get tired sooner or later. It's just going to take them 15-20 minutes, maybe half an hour to stretch before they need relief. Whereas with a coincidence rangefinder, you can basically be there all day. The slight upside to stereoscopic rangefinders is, in theory, you can dial them in a little bit more quickly, precisely because they are mimicking the natural vision process, and you'll really want to as well. Whereas with a coincidence rangefinder, because you're trying to do a compare and contrast between two split images, it can take a little longer, but obviously a lot of that will also come down to training. Jim Smitty asks, as I'm reading In Passage Perilous, Malta and the Convoy Battles of June 1942 by Vincent O'Hara, good thing to read, actually, I recommend you pick it up, it became clear to me that the Royal Navy had basically sunk all of its eggs in the Malta basket, so to speak, by the 1930s. It served as the main base for the Mediterranean fleet, along with having a bunch of infrastructure needed for supporting the fleet itself. This left the port at Alexandria, from my understanding, underdeveloped. With the clouds of war gathering, why didn't the Royal Navy start building up Alexandria to allow it to better support the Mediterranean fleet, given how exposed Malta was? Was it lack of funding, or an honest belief they could keep using Malta as a base, even with the growing threat from aircraft? There are a number of factors involved here. Firstly, Malta had at that point, centuries of build-up. Alexandria had only come under British control a few decades earlier, and while Malta was a fully integrated part of the British Empire, Alexandria was a British-controlled element, but at the beginning of the interwar period, Britain had given up its administration of Egypt as a protectorate, which it had declared at the start of the First World War. And technically, at that point, Egypt was an independent country. So the British had a base in Alexandria, and they were allowed to do that, as well as around the Suez Canal. However, they weren't in their own territory. They were essentially guests in a foreign country, and that meant that there was relatively little incentive to spend vast amounts of money upgrading Alexandria, because there was always a risk the Egyptians might just go and take it back, and they also didn't have, the full infrastructure of a country locally to back them up. And if they did start doing major investments into Alexandria, there's every chance the Egyptians might object, because while the British had their base, and as I said, they were allowed to do that, technically speaking, the Egyptians could still object if they did specific major changes there. Whereas with Malta, it was just part of the British Empire. And there is another element to it, which is how likely was it that the British were going to need to base the fleet out of Alexandria? It was a useful secondary base in their mind, but even as war clouds were gathering, when they were looking at their various plans, the British had anticipated that the next war would be fighting one, possibly two powers out of a combination of Japan, Italy, and Germany. And obviously, if they fought Japan or they fought Germany, then the fleet in the Mediterranean might as well be at Malta, because they weren't at any particular risk. If they fought Japan and Italy, then a fleet at Malta would be necessary to try and pin the Italian fleet in place as much as possible to allow safe movement of supplies through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, to go and fight Japan. And if they fought Germany and Italy, they were far more likely to have the French involved. I mean, the French and the British were allied, so even if they were fighting, say, Japan and Italy, there was a decent chance that the French would be involved. Obviously, if they were just fighting Italy, and it was Britain and France versus Italy, they'd be right on the Italians' doorstep, which suited them just fine. But even if they were fighting Germany and Italy at the same time, there was this assumption that they would have the Marine Nationale to back them up. And between the Marine Nationale and the Mediterranean fleet, there was precious little the Italians could have done to dislodge them from Malta, and the air threat as such was only really growing in everybody's perceptions right at the very end of the 1930s, and even then, people were thinking in terms of, okay, well, we'll put more anti-aircraft guns in, we'll put more aircraft down, fighters, etc., and of course we've got the newly fangled radar coming along, so that should be enough between heavy anti-aircraft batteries, fighters, and radar to keep the Italians away. And at the same time, obviously gives you a good base to go out and hit the Italians. It's only once you end up with war being declared, and it's Germany and Italy, and then Japan also jumping in, and France being taken out so quickly, thus the Marine Nationale not being available, and the Marine Nationale now under Vichy control, potentially being hostile, and then suddenly you're looking at, okay, well, the Mediterranean fleet is significantly depleted from what it was. We weren't able, for budgetary reasons, to install all the defences in Malta that we wanted to, because they were trying to, rebuild the entirety of the Royal Navy and fortify a whole bunch of places, including places like Singapore. And the Italians are now coming for you with German assistance. So it's kind of an absolute worst-case nightmare scenario. And in that context, Malta is not really viable anymore. But I do think sometimes people forget that, because obviously we're all used to how World War II plays out and who's on whose side, so it can seem a little bit obvious now. But back in certainly late 1940, early 1941, with the fall of France, and then obviously in late 41, early 42 with Japan getting involved, this is kind of the British nightmare scenario. This is the 0.01% scenario they really didn't see coming and really hoped wouldn't come, where they're having to fight an additional power beyond that which they ever thought they would, without the major power right next to them who they thought was going to help share a lot of the security burden. Hark asks, if the Japanese managed to get much more use out of their infrared-guided bombs, perhaps getting them operational earlier in the war, building more of them, improving signal-to-noise ratios, maybe deciding only to use them at night so that there's more contrast between sea and ships, then how likely and quickly could the US Navy have figured out how the bombs work? I remember hearing the Japanese never thought the US Navy had something like the VT fuse, concluding they were just very good at anti-air gunnery. And likewise, the British never quite figured out why ships started exploding in Gibraltar, despite the fact it was Italian frogmen just on the other side of the harbour. So perhaps the US Navy would have not managed to determine why the Japanese kept hitting their shipping unusually often? From the perspective of the US Navy, if they knew perhaps that, well, the Japanese seem to be able to bomb better at night, even against targets that evade, the bombers aren't diving on their ships, and the bombers just keep flying on without loitering or slowing down, if the US Navy considers a guided bomb system as an explanation, they would have to draw the following conclusions. No operator has observed the bomb and the target, as no aircraft remains in a position to do so. There's no wire guidance as the aircraft move freely away after bomb release. There are no signals detected, so it's not being guided by radio or TV. And likewise, there's no signal from a radar system, so it's not a radar-guided bomb. And perhaps the Japanese could practice deceptive bombing, where they send out a large group of bombers, only a few of which use IR-guided bombs. The others use manual-aimed bombs, which could result in the Americans just thinking they'd got lucky. I think the US would figure something out relatively quickly, but how they figure it out and when I think is going to depend on a few factors. Firstly, if the Japanese, like the Germans did, go for an elite bombing group that's equipped with these specialist bombs, that I think would actually betray them sooner, because it will become very obvious that if you only have a half dozen bombers and they seem to have a ridiculously high hit rate, especially at night, even against targets that are evading, some kind of guidance mechanism is very clearly in play. Whereas if you have, say, 2 aircraft out of every unit equipped with the IR bombs and trained for it, and you send out maybe 2-3 units, and so there's bombs falling left, right, and centre, and some of them happen to smash into their targets, that will slow things down a lot more, because the initial thought is going to be, okay, well, they're just saturation bombing, and sometimes they're getting lucky. But in either case, one of the giveaways is going to be the significantly higher success rate and the weird fact that it's working better at night compared to, the US's own efforts at saturation bombing using larger aircraft with more bombs, which would be having dramatically less success. So essentially, you could figure out that there's a guided bomb going on by inference, and as you mentioned, there'd be all these various considerations about the fact it's not being guided by some kind of observer and it's not using radar or radio signals. There is, of course, the other way, which is that an IR-guided bomb that hits its target could fail to detonate or partially fail to detonate, or essentially something happens to it in some way, shape, or form. That means that the US gets access to at least the partial, if not complete, remains of one of the IR seeker heads, at which point they're going to look at it and go, well, take it back to their scientists and go, oh, that's what they're doing. Right. Okay, now we can start working on countermeasures. But you might also have some weird incidents where people somehow manage to work out what's going on. So, for example, if a ship starts to make a lot of smoke, one of the ways that you can make smoke is obviously from your funnels. You can have smoke generators, but if you're dumping large amounts of very hot smoke out of the funnels, that could confuse the infrared targeter, and that might give them a clue as to what's going on. Because if they notice, well, ships that make a ton of smoke seem to, and the ships nearby them, seem to have a lot greater survival odds than the ships that just run for the wind, or perhaps maybe a carrier or a battleship, something that can take several hits, takes a hit and fires started it, and they notice, oh, hang on a minute, there's fires on this ship, and suddenly bombs seem to be attracted to it like moths to a flame. Either of those, they might go, oh, hang on a minute, well, it can't be a visual targeting system because it's at night. But when there's heat involved, bombs go for it, therefore it must be some kind of thermal sensor. And of course, if the Japanese use them to go after land targets, dropping them over airfields and so forth on the basis that hangars and barracks will be warmer, and perhaps the cafeterias keep getting nailed because they've got lots of cooking equipment in them, again, also possibility of duds, and crashed aircraft that might have intact bombs in them. These are all ways where either the nature of the homing system or the precise form of the homing system could either be inferred or discovered. So if we hypothesize that maybe the Japanese magically come up with this in, let's say, mid-1942, I don't think their secret's going to last through the entire war. I think at best the secret would last a year, possibly less. And then there would obviously be some time trying to work out the countermeasure to it as well. And what you might end up with is some form of modified depth charge launcher, or maybe a modified hedgehog spigot mortar system, where instead of firing explosives at submarines, it's instead, with a depth charge launcher, maybe firing reloadable relatively quickly, and with a hedgehog launcher, maybe launching in a pattern, some kind of floating high-temperature flare. Significantly, obviously, larger and longer lasting than the flares used on jet aircraft in the era of infrared-guided missiles. But essentially, the idea would be that when a Japanese bomber formation shows up overhead, you launch a bunch of these things, and suddenly there's a load of really bright high-temperature point sources all around your fleet, which the bombs would naturally be drawn to because they're going to be the hottest things around. Leon Wu asks, long tons, what the heck are they? We hear that a ship displaces X tons. Is that long or short or normal tons? Yeah, so unhelpfully, there are actually 3 tons in use at the time that the channel covers. And they all have the same names, the same pronunciation, although one is spelt slightly differently. And it all comes down to different ways of measuring, which is mildly unhelpful because the US imperial system is different from the British imperial system in some ways, which gives us the long ton and the short ton. And then you have the metric system, but obviously the metric system in most other weights, kilogram, gram, or so forth, they use a different weight system from pounds and ounces, at least, but then everybody just uses the word ton, and yeah, very unhelpful. So, of course, the metric ton, and which is sometimes spelled TONNE to distinguish it from the imperial tons, is 1,000 kilos. Then you have the short ton, which is the US ton, and that is because in both imperial systems, a ton is defined as 20 hundredweight, but then in the UK, in the imperial system, in the British imperial system, a hundredweight is defined as 8 stone, and each stone is made up of 14 pounds, thus a hundredweight is 112 pounds, whereas in the US, it goes ounces, pounds, hundredweight. You may have seen it abbreviated as CWT, and the US hundredweight is just 100 pounds because they don't seem to have the intervening stone demarcation. And so that means that a US ton, or the short ton, made of 20 hundredweight is 2,000 pounds because 20 times 100, whereas the British long ton is also made up of 20 hundredweight, but since each hundredweight is 112 pounds, that actually means the British ton is 2,240 pounds. So that means the British imperial ton is slightly heavier than the metric ton. The US short ton is slightly less than the metric ton. But then on top of all of that, you have the fact that, of course, when it comes to measuring displacement, measuring it in actual tons by weight as opposed to TUN tons as a measure of cargo carrying capacity came about when Britain ruled the seas, and therefore Britain used its long ton as a way of measuring displacement for its ships, and basically by the fact that they were the ones who built most of the ships and controlled most of the ships, most everyone else started using the same measures, and so another name for the imperial ton or the long ton is the displacement ton, and so that ton, the long ton, is what would be used for measuring a ship's displacement. However, of course, because it is generically the ton at the time, very often you will just see it referred to as the ton, and it will be the US ton that's referred to as the short ton, and obviously metric tons as well. So when you see the tonnage of a ship mentioned in the time period the channel covers, it's in imperial long tons, unless specified otherwise. Jan Roxniak, I think, asks, could you please present the Dreadnought Race from 1905 to the end of World War I? Robert K. Massey in his book Dreadnought includes a summary for Britain and Germany, but there were other countries involved, especially the US and Japan, among others. Well, I think a full presentation of the Dreadnought Race from, let's say, 1905 to 1921, right before the Washington Treaty, if we're going to show ships, main guns, caliber of guns, when they're built, when they enter service, etc., that's like a whole video in and of itself. But very briefly, to summarize it here, essentially the main Dreadnought Race is Britain versus Germany, and everyone else is kind of an also-ran up until the start of the First World War. And that's because in the period between the laying down of Dreadnought and the start of the First World War, on average, roughly speaking, Britain is laying down 4 battleships a year, plus battlecruisers here and there. The Germans, from the time they lay down the Nassaus in 1907, are laying down approximately just a little under 3 battleships a year, plus, of course, battlecruisers. And their next nearest competitors, the Americans, are laying down around about half that many. The US actually averages, again going from the year they start laying down Dreadnought battleships with the South Carolinas to the beginning of World War I, they're actually averaging about 1.5 battleships a year. And no battlecruisers compared to Britain and Germany, which obviously are building a number of those. And that's in part because the US doesn't actually lay down any battleships at all in 1908, and only one in 1913 and one in 1914, that being Pennsylvania and Arizona. While the Japanese do obviously get the 4 Congos, if we're looking purely at battleships, they actually average slightly under 1 per year, and that's if we go from the Kawachis, which are laid down in 1909, through to the beginning of World War I. If you kind of count the Satsumas as semi-dreadnoughts, and obviously they lay down Satsuma in 1905, the average gets even worse. So you might call them participants in the Dreadnought Race, but the British and the Germans were basically lapping the Japanese and the Americans in terms of rate of capital ship construction. Where this changes is during World War I, because during World War I, technically the Germans lay down 1 battleship, that being Württemberg, which is never completed. The British don't lay down any, and although both Britain and Germany will lay down battle cruisers, Renown, Repulse, and Hood in the case of the British, the Courageouses if you really want to count them, and if you want to go by laid down, the other 3 admirals as well, and the Germans, of course, lay down the Mackensons and one of the Ersatz Yorks, but none of those are completed. Whereas, thanks to being extremely isolated from the actual front lines in the case of Japan and not taking part for the majority of the war in the case of the US, the Japanese and the Americans are able to continue building. So the Japanese build 4 more battleships, or at least they lay them down, that being the Iseis and the Nagatos, while World War I is going on. And the Americans lay down 6 new battleships during that time period, that being the New Mexicos, the Tennessees, and Maryland, the other 3 Colorados not being laid down until after World War I. So that's a brief summary, but as I said, it's probably worth a whole video to look through exact build dates, commissions, broadside weights, and so forth at some point. Will Sanders asks, many modern fast-firing autocannons and naval guns incorporate water cooling on their barrels. Likewise, there are stories of fire hoses being used to cool anti-aircraft guns. Was permanent water cooling ever seriously considered during the age of the quick-firing gun? As far as I'm aware, in the era of the quick-firing gun, i.e. the period the channel covers, no, there wasn't ever any serious thoughts to permanently building water-cooling jackets into quick-firing weapons. And that's for a mixture of reasons. Obviously, if you put a water-cooling jacket over a artillery gun, then that's going to add quite considerably to the weight. And you've got to remember a lot of quick-firing guns, for the majority of the period that they existed, were still manually trained and operated, and elevated for that matter. So if you put a heavy jacket of water plus the containment systems, etc., on it, then that's going to cause some fairly significant issues in terms of the speed at which you can aim that gun, which, especially if it's a dual-purpose or anti-aircraft weapon, and to a certain extent even if it's an anti-torpedo boat weapon, could cause major issues. On top of that, it's another thing to go wrong, another thing that needs maintaining. It's very complicated mechanically, and most of the time the quick-firing guns are being used in positions, whether they be as secondary batteries on larger ships or primary batteries on smaller ships, where you can realistically in combat expect shrapnel and blast to be flying around from incoming enemy fire, and things like water cooling jackets and their mechanisms would be quite vulnerable to that kind of damage. Plus there's the additional cost and so forth, and then when you compare and contrast that to the relatively few times where guns actually ended up firing for sustained periods at such high rates, that heat started to become an issue, and the cost-benefit just wasn't there. You know, you'd suffer quite considerably in your ability to put aimed fire down for a relatively minimal gain, and in the very rare circumstances that you actually did need to emergency cool the guns, well, as we've seen on the channel before, and as you mentioned, fire hoses exist. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better and easier than permanently installing water jackets on everything. These days, as far as I understand it, when it comes to water-cooled, if you like, heavy guns, i.e. something bigger than a machine gun, it's either because to maintain that rate of fire you actually absolutely have to have some form of advanced cooling, otherwise it's going to start to bend, warp or melt. And when it comes to naval guns and so forth, those things are now both power-trained, which admittedly was coming in World War II, but also the power training systems are considerably more advanced, considerably more powerful, and can deal with, you know, moving around the weight of a water cooling system as well as the gun and the autoloader relatively easily, whereas power training systems in the 1930s and 40s were kind of like the quick-firing system had been at the turn of the century, gradually catching up with and overhauling various grades of smaller gun, and so overloading them with additional weight just wasn't really on the cards. John McCarthy asks, I enjoyed the recent video on plunging fire. I wonder, how much deck armour would be needed to reject typical World War II bombs from dive bombers? Which ships had enough? And were any battleships attacked by dive bombers? Yes, indeed, plenty of battleships on pretty much all sides were attacked by dive bombers. I think the only people who significantly got out of that particular quandary were the Italians, mostly because in the Mediterranean the British weren't really using dive bombers. The only dive bomber, or dedicated dive bomber, that the fleet air arm possessed was the Skua, and perhaps fortunately for everybody, the Skua wasn't really in service anymore by the time the Italians got involved in World War II, at least in a frontline role. And by the time the Royal Navy adopted the next aircraft, which explicitly had dive bombing capability built in, that being the Barracuda, the Italians were out of the war. There were, of course, a few attacks right towards the end of the Italian involvement in World War II on the Axis side when they switched sides, and then the Italians obviously had their armistice, and then the co-belligerent navy switched side, but regardless, you know the period I'm talking about, and the Germans did obviously have a crack at the Italians with various aircraft, including a handful of Stukas, depending on which particular engagement you're looking at. Obviously, Roma was level bombers with guided bombs, but anyway, my general point is the Italians, the Regia Marina, were pretty much the only major fleet that didn't have its capital ships regularly attacked by dive bombers. The British obviously experienced Stukas, both from the Germans and the Italians. The Americans experienced the wonders of the Val and its successor aircraft from the hands of the Japanese. The Japanese obviously got hit by Dauntlesses and Helldivers, and of course these are just the dedicated dive bombers. This isn't counting other aircraft that could do dive bombing of a sort. And the Germans got to be on the receiving end of both the Skua and the Barracuda. And, I mean, technically even the Marine Nationale got a little bit of dive bombing aimed their way at the Battle of Casablanca by various Dauntlesses. Unfortunately, in terms of how much deck armour was needed to reject typical World War II bombs from dive bombers, it's a very open question, because there's no such thing as a typical World War II bomb from a dive bomber. Dive bombers could be equipped with a range of bombs from general purpose bombs, which you might otherwise call high explosive, semi-armor piercing bombs, or even armor piercing bombs. And obviously, there's the clues in the name as to how much capability each of those might have against deck armor. But on top of that, various dive bombers were capable of carrying various payloads. And so if you were, say, going up against the Japanese for most of the war, the typical dive bomber at the time, so the Val and its immediate successors, would usually be using the 550-pound bomb. Whereas in exactly the same theatre at exactly the same time, if a Dauntless came after you, you might be on the receiving end of a 500-pounder, if it was a scouting Dauntless, or a Dauntless operating in extreme range. But if it was a Dauntless from a bomber squadron, or they'd launched specifically at very short range, it would be a 1,000-pounder, which is obviously a considerably different issue compared to a 500 or 550-pounder. The various European Axis dive bombers, mostly Stukas, would show up with a whole variety of bombs. There are records of little 50-pound anti-personnel bombs in large numbers, all the way through up to absolutely monstrous 2,200-pound or more bombs, which frankly was a little bit cruel to the poor old Stukas who had to waddle into the skies carrying these things aloft, but they did occasionally have them. You'll note I'm not including the Japanese converted 16-inch shells because they were actually being used as level bombs by the Kates, not dive bombs by the Vals. And then for the British, the Skewer dropped a relatively small bomb, not that it helped Königsberg, and then once the Barracuda came in, the Barracuda actually showed up with a 1,600-pound armour-piercing bomb. But then even if you choose a particular armour-piercing bomb, whether it be one of the 1,600-pounder British ones, or the monstrous German ones, or a tiny Japanese one, or something in between, you've then got to account for dive angle and release height, because if you are diving very, very steeply, then obviously the bomb is going to strike more towards perpendicular, which is going to increase its level of apparent penetration because the apparent thickness of the armour is going to be less. Whereas if the dive bomber comes in at a shallower angle, well, the bomb is obviously going to start falling more and more towards a vertical, but if that dive bomber has released its bomb at a relatively low altitude, there will probably still be a reasonable element of horizontal travel to that bomb, which will increase the apparent armour thickness of a deck. And coupled to that, I mentioned release altitude. That is another huge factor, because if the dive bomber releases really low, they might get good accuracy, but the bomb might not have time to spool up to terminal velocity, and therefore its armour-piercing capability will be less. Whereas if the dive bomber drops its bomb from higher, obviously there's more time for the bomb to fall, which means there's more time for the ship to get out of the way. The ship is a smaller target apparent to the vision of the dive bomber pilot at the time, and therefore he might just miss anyway. But the flip side is that bomb has more time to build up speed and therefore energy, and will penetrate the deck more. So, for example, the shorthand is for British armoured flight deck carriers. Their shorthand is that they're designed to resist a 500-pound bomb from a dive bomber, which is true. That is what they're designed to do. But the spec is actually, when you look closer, it's designed to defeat a 500-pound bomb from a dive bomber regardless of altitude drop. It's also designed to defeat a 1,000-pound bomb from a dive bomber, but there is a maximum altitude from which that bomb can be dropped and for the armour to be effective. If the 1,000-pound bomb is dropped above that altitude, it will go through. So at that point, having enough deck armour is a very moving target, because if you are, say, in the early Pacific War and you are under attack by the Japanese, then 3 to 4 inches of deck armour is going to protect you from basically anything that the Vals can chuck at you. But if you take exactly the same ship on exactly the same day even, and port that through to the Mediterranean, and you find a German Stuka gratefully releasing a 2,200-pounder or worse bomb at you so that it can, actually try and fly rather than repel itself from the ground by sheer desperation, that bomb will smash straight through a 3 to 4 inch thick deck, no problem at all. There is also a small matter of nomenclature in terms of what constitutes armour piercing or not, because you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute. Some of these larger bombs weigh as much or more than some battleship shells, and yet you're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 inches of deck armour, depending on the bomb, able to resist them. So what gives, given that, that much armour on the belt isn't going to resist a shell of about the same weight? And, well, there's two issues to that. First is, of course, a shell has been fired, so it has a lot of momentum, a lot of speed coming from the fact it has been fired by a big explosion, whereas bombs, generally speaking at least, are free-falling under gravity, so they have a limit to their terminal velocity and thus a limit to how much energy they can gain before they hit you. But on top of that is also armour piercing means slightly different things when you're talking about shells, when you're talking about bombs. So, for example, if you look at the PC 1400 bomb, which is one of the heavier German armour-piercing bombs, and which would later actually become the Fritz X after significant modification, that thing weighs 1.4 metric tons, or just over 3,000 pounds, so it weighs about as much as one of Yamato's 18.1-inch shells. However, it's wider than the 18.1-inch shell, it's 22 inches in diameter. But while the Yamato's shell has an explosive to shell body weight ratio of 1.6%, so that only 1.6% of the overall mass is explosive, something like 21.5% of the German bomb's weight is explosive, which obviously means the rest of the bomb cannot be as structurally sound and as resistive to impact as the 18.1-inch shell, simply because there's nowhere near as much steel involved. And in actual fact, the explosive to mass ratio of most armour-piercing bombs of the period is actually even higher than even the explosive mass to overall mass ratio of CPC shells, or semi-armour-piercing shells, in the World War I and pre-World War I period. So while these bombs do have armour-piercing capability, obviously they do have an armour-piercing cap up front, you shouldn't imagine that these bombs have anything close to the same levels of penetration as a similar weight or diameter battleship or cruiser shell. Matt Kidd asks, did commanders of groups of American fleet subs command their formations from sea or at port? And were squadron commanders also commanding a submarine? You've actually hit right on the divide. So squadron commanders, generally speaking, would be commanding from land. Very often a squadron commander may well have commanded a submarine in the past, but a squadron commander, once they were in that position, would generally be commanding from a station ashore or perhaps in a submarine support vessel, but they wouldn't be out at sea commanding a submarine themselves. So, for example, Charles Mompson, as you can see here in this picture, was one of the squadron commanders of US submarines during the Second World War, but he did not take a submarine to sea during that time period. However, when you're talking about the groups of American fleet subs utilised later on, essentially mini wolf packs, although they went by different titles within the US Navy's parlance, those were commanded at sea, and it would essentially just be who is the senior most officer in that group of 3 or 4 submarines, and they would be the one in operational command of the group while they were out and about. Although obviously all of the subs would still receive direction and intel and so forth from ashore, but in terms of, well, we're in a line, but we should go over here, or I'm hunting this convoy, come and help, that would be generally the role of the senior submarine captain actually in that wolf pack, if you like. Lawson Say asks, recently, a certain Scottish directed energy porcine-themed content creator claimed that the reason HMS Prince of Wales survived a diving shell hit at Denmark Strait when Hood did not was due to a shift in armour protection philosophy brought on by the Battle of Jutland from rejecting hits to containing damage. Is there any validity to this theory, and what actual changes in survivability designs of warships can be attributed to the lessons from Jutland? For those of you who want to hear what Lazerpig had to say, you can go and have a look at his video in response to the announcement of the latest US Navy quote-unquote battleship, at 15 minutes 20 seconds timestamp, if you just want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting anything he says. Now, unfortunately, this section of his video, I'm not going to comment on the rest of it because that's obviously very much commenting on modern politics, which we don't do on this channel, but this section is quite wrong. So there's some little nitpicks at the start. He says, oh, it's 4 battleships shooting each other in a line. Well, that's not the case. Prince Eugen is a heavy cruiser. Hood is a battlecruiser. Now, you could, make an argument for hyperbole saying it's 2 British battleships versus the German, because Hood is right on the edge of being a fast battleship. Indeed, myself and many others would consider her to be a fast battleship, even if she is designated a battlecruiser, but Prince Eugen definitely isn't. Then Hood, was she destroyed by a hit to her main magazines? Well, the vast majority of modern scholarship would say no. I think, however, that isn't actually a real point of contention, because she obviously was destroyed by her magazines being detonated. As I've outlined in my own theory on why Hood was destroyed, the best evidence seems to be that a shell arrived in her aft machinery space and then either went into or set off the 4-inch high-angle magazine, the anti-aircraft magazine, which in turn, after a few moments, set off the main magazine. But to be perfectly honest, in the grand scheme of things, saying Hood was destroyed because her magazines exploded is, it's a fair enough brief summary, even if it gets the actual mechanism slightly wrong. And even those who think that Hood was penetrated through her deck armour, even most of those people don't believe it was a direct hit to the main magazines. It's basically the 4-inch magazine is set off, then the 15-inch. It's just a question of people arguing over the delivery mechanism for that. Now, the bigger problem comes in just after 16 minutes on the timestamp, when he says that Prince of Wales suffered exactly the same hit. So if we look at this hit diagram of Prince of Wales, slightly zoomed in so you can see it more clearly, this is on the HMS Hood Association website, you'll notice that there are 7 hits tabulated on Prince of Wales. Numbers 2, 4, 6 and 7 are from Prince Eugen. These are 8-inch shell hits, and they basically did nothing, as you might expect. Hits 1, 3 and 5 are hits from Bismarck. So you have hit 1, that's the famous hit to the bridge that kills almost everybody there except for Captain Leach. You have hit number 3, which punches a hole in the funnel, which is annoying, but doesn't do all that much. Incidentally, in case anyone's wondering what happened with hit number 4, the 8-inch hit on the boat deck near one of the 5.25-inch guns, that actually just didn't explode. Quite a number of these German shells that hit didn't explode or only partially exploded, which was something of a problem with German shells at the time. In fact, of all of them, only shells 6 and 7, the Prince Eugen's hits aft, actually resulted in anything close to what you might categorise as a proper detonation. The hit that Lazerpig is almost certainly referring to is hit number 5, which, as you can see, is right way down deep, well below the belt armour, just beneath the aft funnel. Now, anyone who's familiar with ship layouts will know that, well, the thing that's directly adjacent to the funnel, or below the funnel in this case, is going to be the boiler rooms, not the magazines. And, well, look at the diagram, look at where the aft quadruple 14-inch turret is. The magazines are below that. And, well, you can see there is quite a bit of distance between hit number 5 there and where the magazines would be for the aft turret. So this is nowhere near the magazines. In fact, I will now read to you from the report from HMS Prince of Wales on what happened with that particular shell. It says, during the early morning action on May 24th, a heavy hit was felt abreast the starboard diesel room. It was found that the outer airspace is 184 to 196, the outer oil fuel tank 186-206, and inner airspace 184-194, the starboard diesel tank 184-206, were filled to the crown with oil and water. On Friday the 6th of June, on pumping out the Drydock, a clean hole in the side about 15 inches in diameter was found, a foot above the bilge keel at 187 starboard. That's frame number 187. Holes were also found in the light plating forming the sides of the outer oil fuel tank, 184-206. Heavy marking was found on the protective bulkhead, but there were no signs of explosion. When the ship's bottom was visible, it became apparent there was no exit hole, and a search was made for the shell. The inner airspace 184-194 was pumped out, and the shell was found to be lying on the bottom between two frames, 190 and 192, nose forward. The shell was in good condition with a fuse in place, but without the ballistic cap. The angle of entry was 10 degrees from forward, and the angle of descent, measured from the perpendicular, was 2 to 4 degrees. Without rough treatment, the removal of the shell either upwards or downwards presented difficulty. Finally, it was decided to lower it through the bottom. The shell was lifted by chain purchases, 1 inch clear, slung by a quick action grab. Special lifting bands supplied by the bomb disposal officer from HMS Cochrane were then fitted and screwed firmly around the shell. It was then lowered, slung by the lifting bands, and hoisted 5 foot clear. 7 sets of supporting blocks were removed from under the protective bulkhead in the dock, and a hole 4 foot by 2 foot was burnt under the shell. This necessitated cutting into 2 bottom plates. The shell was lowered into this hole on a rubber-tied ammunition trolley and wheeled aft, where a dockyard crane picked it up, and it was then placed in the bomb disposal boat and removed. Now, the problem with what Lazerpig then goes on to claim is that he says that Prince of Wales's armour did the job of protecting her. And this is fundamentally untrue. As you can probably see from the upper diagram, you can see the big rectangle of Prince of Wales's armour, mostly above the waterline, but also extending somewhat below the waterline. But you can also see that hit number 5 occurs well below the waterline. So, in actual fact, there is no armour in this area this deep in the ship at all, except for maybe the very lower reaches of the torpedo defence system, but that is not armour that is in any way, shape or form going to disrupt the shell. Lazerpig also says that Prince of Wales was very lucky that the ship wasn't blown sky high. Well, it was found in an airspace next to some diesel and oil tanks. Even if it had exploded, Prince of Wales was never going to be blown sky high by that. At worst, you'd have some flooding, which would be annoying, especially if the explosion managed to crack further bulkheads internally and it resulted in some machinery space flooding. But that's not going to blow the ship up because it's nowhere near the magazines. And as I said, it's nothing to do with the armour scheme. The entire reason the shell is there is because it failed. Because a shell, upon hitting water, hits water going very fast, and as most of you will know, if you hit water very fast, it's basically like hitting a solid object, and as far as the fuse on a shell is concerned, it is hitting a solid object, and so the fuse starts to initiate. Armour-piercing shells have a very slight delay built into them, because of course they're going to hit, theoretically, an armoured portion of the ship. You don't want the shell to immediately detonate like a high-explosive shell would, because then it explodes outside the ship, most of the explosion goes outside, and nothing much happens. So you put a very, very, very slight delay, we're talking fractions of a second here, where the shell will punch through the armour, hopefully, if it's doing its job, like a solid shot, and then once it's inside the ship, it explodes. Now, if you hit the water, obviously the shell is going to travel slightly further because water is less dense than steel, but it will still explode, which is why when shells miss a ship and they hit the water, they go boom. But that distance is very limited by the, in human terms, exceptionally short nature of the delay on the shell. And this is why the main belt armour on Prince of Wales is somewhat below the waterline, because they calculated, well, at the ranges where shells are likely to hit, what's the likely impact with the water going to be? How far down could a shell go without detonating and therefore potentially hit the hull and get inside and detonate? Okay, we know how far that shell has to go. We can lower the armour to address that. And that's what they do. This isn't actually anything to do with Jutland. This is to do with post-war tests that reveal diving shells are a problem. And multiple navies discover this issue separately. The Japanese discover it when they're testing on Tosa. The British discover it partly through wartime experience, partly through tests on the old super dreadnought HMS Emperor of India. But the long and the short of it is that this deep down on the ship, there is no way a shell whose fuse has actually initiated properly is ever going to reach there. So what happened when they examined the shell after they took it away is that it seems that when the shell hit the water, because German shells, unlike Japanese shells, which were at the other end of this particular spectrum, German shells were not designed to dive underwater, therefore they were not hydrodynamically stable underwater, and that meant that when the German shell had hit the water, the fuse had initiated, but the shell had tumbled so violently that the little flame trail that the fuse needed to use to get to the point of actually detonating was disrupted, and the shell then failed to work, which is why they say when they found it, the fuse was still there, it just hadn't completed its job properly, and with the flame out, there was no way it was ever going to complete its job properly. And thus, as a dud, because the shell didn't explode, it just kept going on its own momentum, on obviously a downward angled trajectory, having landed quite short of the ship, and eventually hit the outer hull plating and punched through a couple of relatively thin sheets of metal before fetching up, as they mentioned in the report, and that was that. So there is no... Basically, if a shell came down this far, it's because its fuse isn't working and it's not going to explode. Therefore, it doesn't pose all that much of any risk to the ship at all. Even if it had hit adjacent to the main magazine, it still wouldn't be a threat at this point because it's just a lump of metal with some interesting spicy contents if you decide you're going to crack it open or something like that. Now, the problem is he then goes on to say that the difference is that Hood and Prince of Wales are pre- and post-Jutland ships, which is actually also wrong because Hood was laid down pre-Jutland, and while she didn't have all the changes implemented on her that other post-Jutland ships would have, she did have her armour scheme very heavily revised post-Jutland because she was only partway under construction. Then he goes on to talk about what post-Jutland ships and their protective schemes are supposedly about. Now, bear in mind, obviously, this is all built on the faulty premise that somehow Prince of Wales's armour, which didn't exist that far down, is responsible for her not exploding. But nonetheless, the idea is posited that post-Jutland armour is no longer about stopping shell penetration. It's about coping with the damage when it does happen and deflecting the shell or preventing it from exploding. Fundamentally, actually, this is completely the opposite way round. This is completely the wrong way round. And the pre- and post-Jutland schemes, if anything, I mean, you could describe the differences a bit more accurately, but if anything, it is the complete opposite, because a pre-Jutland armour scheme, which Hood to an extent has, because I said not all the changes that they wanted to make were made, was based around, at least for most navies, the distributed armour scheme. Now, the Americans had gotten the jump on everyone in the Dreadnought era in putting the all-or-nothing armour scheme in, but we'll come back to that later. And the idea of the pre-Jutland armour scheme was actually more about mitigating damage, because you had a main belt, and yes, in theory, hopefully that main belt would stop the incoming fire, but you also had multiple other thicknesses of armour distributed elsewhere around the ship, and these were more about stopping secondary battery fire, high explosives, CPC, or semi-armour piercing, fragments, and so on and so forth, but they would not stop a main caliber shot. And everyone understood this. But the theory went that in the non-main belt, non-citadel, non-barbette, non-turret areas, these thinner bits of armour, while they could stop, as I said, blast, fragment, shrapnel, near misses, small caliber shells, high explosives, etc., if they were hit by a main caliber shell, they would at least have some protective value because they would initiate the shell fuse, because they were still solid enough to do that. And that would mean that the shell would explode after only travelling partway into the ship, whereas if the hull was just thin hull plating, then the shell could potentially travel quite a bit into the ship before exploding, or potentially do a through and through, depending on which part of the ship you're actually hit in. Obviously, bow and stern somewhat thinner, you could get through and throughs there, whereas the more the ship widens out, the more likely is the shell to explode deeper into the ship, or potentially, contact deck armour and do something nasty there. But part of the trade-off of having this distributed armour scheme is you only have so much weight on a ship, and of that weight you can only allocate up to a certain percentage to armour without compromising on speed, firepower, etc. And thus, you end up in a situation where the protective belt is either not necessarily as thick as you'd like it to be, or it covers less of the ship than you would like it to, if it's of the thickness you want it to be. Both of which, as you can see, would be weaknesses. Post-Jutland, you see a concentration of armour, basically everyone kind of, except for the Germans, with Bismarck, move toward the more all-or-nothing style of armour, where, mostly speaking, not entirely, because people still put some armour over steering gear and so forth, but mostly the armour gets concentrated much more heavily over the things that are the most vital, the magazines and the propulsion, forming the ship's citadel. So you have big, thick, heavy slabs of armour over those areas, thick deck armour, and to a certain degree everything outside that is left essentially unprotected. Obviously the barbettes and the turrets have their own armour, they're part of the citadel. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to thicken up that armour, because you have roughly the same percentage of weight that you could allocate to your protection, except now, because it's not distributed across the entire ship, you can concentrate all that weight in a smaller space, which means that armour is thicker, and that makes your armour more likely to outright reject and prevent penetration by a shell, which was one of the main takeaways of Jutland, because, well, you look at Invincible or Indefatigable, certainly, and there's a very good argument why you don't want things penetrating your armour at all. Now, you see angled armour deployed on things like Nelson, the US fast battleships, etc., various other vessels. This is not about deflecting shells. In fact, deflecting a shell with angled armour is possibly one of the worst things you could envisage doing, if that was in fact your aim, because a shell is obviously dropping in from above. If it hits the angled armour and is deflected downwards, it is going to deflect past the bottom of the armour, below the waterline, and then when it explodes, it's either going to drive fragments straight into the magazines or the machinery space that the belt armour was trying to protect, which is obviously bad, or if it detonates somewhat higher, perhaps while it's sliding down the armour belt or something, it's still going to detonate below the waterline, and it's going to cause a lot of flooding, which is also bad. Whereas, if it had hit above the waterline and just exploded, well, you might get a little bit of flooding from waves and so forth, but otherwise you'd be fine. Also, the deeper the explosion takes place in the ship, the harder that it is to do damage control, because the water pressure is higher. What that sloped armour is in fact designed to do is to increase the apparent thickness of the belt armour to the incoming shell by causing a greater angle of incidence of impact. The shell is not deflecting off the armour, it's still trying to burrow through, but if you look at the deck penetration video I did a little recently, and I talked about, at this angle it has a certain apparent thickness, at this greater angle off of perpendicular it has a even greater apparent thickness. This is exactly what sloped armour is trying to do. It's actually trying to maximise the apparent thickness of the belt relative to the incoming shell, while still being economical and not cutting massively into the ship's internal volume, which is explicitly designed to reject and stop penetration by the incoming shell. Now, that does mean there are some compromises when it comes to this design, because you can put your sloped armour on the outside of your ship, but then you have to adjust the hull form, and that may have other negative effects elsewhere. Or you can have armour that conforms to the side of the hull of your ship, which is what the King George V's do, but since across most of the vital area that means it's going to be vertical, and therefore doesn't have the slope to increase apparent thickness, you have to have thicker armour to compensate, which is why the King George V's have some of the thickest armour ever deployed on a battleship until the Yamatos are launched. And there is some advantage as well at closer ranges, because obviously at closer ranges, shells coming in flatter, the apparent angle caused by the angling of your armour decreases and gets closer to the actual true thickness of the armour. So in closer range engagements, the King George V's slab-sided armour actually increases relative to the sloped armour aficionados. But all of that obviously is predicated on what kind of ranges you're expecting your ship to try and fight at. And the British battle strategy was essentially to engage at longer range, but to close the distance quite quickly to essentially point-blank slugging distances, whereas they had in fact included sloped armour on the Nelson class before, which were envisaged as fighting at longer ranges, and of course the Americans mostly envisaged their ships fighting at longer ranges. Unsurprisingly, you find sloped armour there. But if you have your sloped armour internally, so that your hull can be of an appropriate shape, yes, this does mean that you're going to have a void space outside of your belt armour, which, if you get hit by a shell, is going to be opened up to the elements, whether that be the air if it hits high, or water if it hits at or slightly below the waterline. But that isn't about absorbing, deflecting, or preventing the detonation of a shell. It's just basically a sacrificial void space. It's a compromise to maintain your hull form while also having your protection. And it is one of the minor drawbacks of sloped armour. Incidentally, you'll notice I used hull-conforming armour for the King George V's because, well, the armour plate conforms to the hull, and if you look at some stern views of King George V class battleships, you find out that the armour plating aft, sort of protecting the back end of the quad 14-inch turret there, is actually very heavily sloped because the hull slopes there. And if you want proof, well, here's the side of King George V. As you can see, abreast the secondary battery, yeah, the armour is pretty much vertical, but look at where the boat is and slightly after that. That's a pretty hefty slope you've got going on. So in actual fact, as I said, the main purpose of post-Jutland armour schemes was actually more focused on preventing penetration by shells into the vital areas of the ship's period than pre-Jutland armour had been. Now, that's not to say there weren't other advances in armour layout at the time. There was somewhat increased or changed levels of internal bulkheads to deal with splintering and spalling, to contain potential damage effects caused by partial penetration or just impacts that hit the belt armour really hard. But that wasn't the main purpose of the reforms. The main purpose of the reforms was, well, hopefully the armour is actually going to stop the penetration period, and here's essentially a catch bulkhead to deal with minor after effects that we might not otherwise want, like hot spalling. About the only armour scheme where you could turn around and say, well, this isn't about necessarily just straight up cold stopping the shells, would be the Italian attempt at a decapping plate. But even then, assuming that it worked as intended, it's still not about deflecting the shell, it's still not about stopping the shell from detonating, it's about stripping off the armour piercing cap so that when the shell hits the internal belt and detonates, it doesn't have the armour penetration capability to penetrate through the main armour belt because the decapping plate has stripped off the armour piercing cap. You're still talking about stopping the penetration dead cold, and the only way in which you're really containing the damage is that you're keeping it outside the belt armour. But that is kind of the point, theoretically, of armour both pre and post Jutland, just with varying levels of emphasis. And, of course, varying levels of success. Now, there was a protection scheme on World War II battleships that did look at containing damage rather than stopping it outright cold, but that was the torpedo protection system, which worked on completely different principles from the armour penetration, but that's because, well, dealing with an underwater explosion by a torpedo is a completely different damage method to a high-velocity armour-piercing shell, and isn't really anything to do with the armour scheme. It's part of overall protective systems, but it is not armour. In fact, armour, as it turns out, is actually one of the worst things to stop a torpedo. And the introduction of protective anti-torpedo schemes has nothing really to do with Jutland. It's just a natural development of the fact there's a lot of torpedoes around and people are getting hit by them, both before and after Jutland. Now, funnily enough, he then goes on to try and apply these principles to modern shipping, and again, I'm not going to comment on that side of things, but the only thing I would say in conclusion of what I think may be the single longest Drydock answer thus far, I think this is almost half an hour just responding to one question, but as you can appreciate, there's a lot that needed to be said, is that the move from massive armour designed to stop penetration cold over to little to no armour and focus on not getting hit first, and if we are hit, then hopefully containing the damage, actually happens after the Second World War, immediately after that, in fact, because in the late 1940s, as I kind of highlighted with the video that I did looking at the immediate post-World War II battleship designs, the simple fact was that armour had been getting thicker and thicker and thicker, But then the advent of all sorts of fancy weaponry and anticipated future weaponry meant that people basically threw their hands up in the air and said, look, unless we're going to have 12 inches of deck armour and 2 feet of belt armour, we physically can't stop the penetration by some pretty hefty weapons because, well, to penetrate 11 inches of deck armour or 23 inches of belt armour or whatever, those weapons are going to be very big and they're going to carry very large warheads. And if they do penetrate, and it just looks like penetration technology is going to get better and better and better, well, if we've put all this weight into armour that's not going to stop them, then that was a waste of time. Therefore, if we ditch all of that weight, we now have a ton of extra weight to put into close-range defences, long-range defences, whether they be surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, cellular division of ships, more electronic warfare, better detection systems. Essentially, the move went not even so much from resisting damage to accepting damage and containing it. It went more to resisting damage by preventing the damage from ever getting near the ship. Because if it did, well, yeah, at that point it's kind of hope your damage control teams weren't part of the fireball and pray to any deity you happen to believe in, because you are going to need it. Cameron Rogers asks, a follow-up to last month's question about the Lexington-class battlecruiser's ability to survive the hits encountered by US battleships during World War II. I went through the various action reports, and most of the hits on armour plates on US battleships were from 8-inch guns, like Massachusetts at Casablanca, and the vast majority of hits on South Dakota at Guadalcanal. 3 large-caliber armour-piercing gun or bomb hits stood out, though. The 14-inch hit to South Dakota's Barbette at Guadalcanal, which may have been a problem for Lexington, but maybe not, as the AP cap might have been knocked off by decking before impact. The 16-inch AP bomb hit on Arizona, which went through 2 layers of deck armour, possibly would have penetrated most World War II battleships. And the 16-inch armour-piercing bomb hit on Tennessee's Turret 3, a 5-inch turret roof, which again probably would have gone through most turret roof armour. Given this, it's fascinating to see how hard it is to predict future conflict damage. The vast majority of World War II battleship damage came at the hands of airdropped or submarine-launched torpedoes, not armour-piercing shells or bombs. So the new question is, the complexity level of predicting future conflict damage seems a bit more like RNG than civil engineering, where loads can be extrapolated and projected. As a warship designer, is it better to be lucky than good? Well, I think any sailor will tell you that if you're given a choice between lucky and good, they'll always take lucky, because luck can get you out of situations that no amount of skill can. But if you can have someone who's both good and lucky, even better. Now, when it comes to the damage that battleships took in the Second World War, yes, to an extent, there was a little bit of left-fieldedness going on, but at the same time, I would say you have to bear in mind the rather special circumstances of the Second World War, because the damage that the post-World War I battleships like the Nelsons, Colorados, and Nagatos were designed to withstand, and the damage and threat that the treaty battleships like the King George V's and the North Carolinas, etc., were designed to withstand, the engineers did a pretty good job in most cases of looking at current threats, designing to resist against that, and projecting out future threats and designing to resist against that within reasonable parameters, obviously mostly centered around a ship action, but in the treaty battleship's case, looking more and more towards air attack. However, with that said, with World War II, you face kind of 2 rather significant issues, one of which is the relatively sudden, not rise of aviation, because of course aviation had been a thing since the 1910s in military purposes, but the sudden acceleration of the damage potential of aviation. Aircraft suddenly got a lot faster, a lot longer range, a lot more capable in the space of a handful of years. You know, when ships are being designed, and bear in mind for something like a North Carolina or King George V, that means design processes happening in 1934 and 1935. Some of the latest and greatest torpedo aircraft would be things like the Blackburn Baffin, an aircraft that can maybe just about crack 130 miles an hour, can go theoretically just under 500 miles, but considerably less when loaded up for strike, has a service ceiling of about 15,000 feet, and has a couple of rifle caliber machine guns, and it can carry a torpedo. And then fast forward to World War II, which for most people is starting only 4 years later. Okay, for the Americans and the Japanese, it's 6 years later, but details. And at that point, you have things like the Kate, and bear in mind, the Kate isn't even the most advanced torpedo bomber out there, although it's one of the better ones. That thing is 100 miles an hour faster than the Baffin, and, given the Baffin's only able to just crack a little bit over 130, that's almost twice as fast. Its cruise speed is about 30 miles an hour faster than the Baffin's top speed. It's got half again as much range. It's got almost twice the ceiling, can fly almost twice as high, and it can carry, they're still carrying an 18-inch torpedo, but it's doing it on a much more capable platform. And you look at fighters, you look at dive bombers, etc. There's been this colossal improvement in capability. And the same thing for submarines. In 1934-35, the Type 7 U-boat doesn't exist. The US Fleet submarine doesn't exist. If you look at submarine threats at that point, they're smaller, they're slower. Attempts have been made to make fleet submarines, and they've all generally been abysmal failures. And then suddenly, in 5 years or so time on average, everything has changed very dramatically. Plus, obviously, things like radar have been developed and started to go into service as well. And to be fair, there are various countermeasures to all of these things, whether they be hydrophones, active sonar, ASDIC, anti-aircraft guns, guided anti-aircraft guns, radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, that is proximity fuses, more prolific autocannons, whether they be 20mm, 40mm, or whatever. But obviously all of these things are reactions to very rapidly increasing threats of a new and novel type. And as reactions, they take a little bit of time to kick in, and it just so happens that the war launches right after the threats become apparent, but right before the main countermeasures can be effectively and widely distributed across the fleet. So for the regular surface warship, World War II is almost a perfect storm of terribleness. If the war had started in 36 or 37, then an awful lot of the capabilities that we associate with major problems for surface warships really wouldn't have been that apparent, if at all, and would be seen as maybe late war developments. And if the war had kicked off in 1942, which is when most people thought it was going to, then quite a lot of the countermeasures would have been in place, as well as new ship classes that were designed with this sudden rise in capabilities in mind. I suppose one of the main differences between warship design and civil engineering is that while in warship design, in, say, the Age of Sail, the threat levels that you have to kind of deal with are roughly similar to what they were when your father was in the business, and when your son's in the business, they'll probably be roughly the same again. Whereas when you go through very rapid periods of technological change, like the late 30s and early 40s, or the 1860s or 1870s, you could start your training to become a warship designer based entirely around one threat, and by the time you finished your training course, the entire theatre of war and conflict may have changed rather dramatically. At which point, the difference would be, I guess, the only real thing that you'd have with civil engineering would be if someone invents some kind of new mega material for constructing buildings that completely throws out all your previous calculations in terms of amount of volume you need and what kind of weird and wonderful structures you can build. But to be perfectly honest, the shift from wood to iron armour, or the rise of air power in the late 30s, is more like someone just deciding to completely upend a basic law of physics, which means you have to completely redesign your buildings. Like, I don't know, birds suddenly start developing the ability, instead of crows dropping nuts in the road to get crushed by cars so that they can pick up the nice, tasty insides, we wake up one day and suddenly birds have decided that they now have the strength to pick up, half-meter diameter tungsten rods, which they just randomly drop on the ground in the hopes of hitting something and killing it. Tradesman's Entrance asks, if Prince of Wales had been leading Hood at the Battle of Denmark Strait, and somehow this led to Prince of Wales being destroyed instead, what ships would Force Z likely have consisted of? In all honesty, probably none, because if you lose Prince of Wales, you not only have lost a modern fast battleship, which frankly is a little bit more valuable than Hood at that point, but also you are going to lose the services of Hood at some point in 1941 because she is in desperate need of a refit and overhaul. So, one way or another, Hood is going to be out of action for a chunk of 1941, which means if you've lost Prince of Wales, you're now down 2 capital ships, at which point you really can't afford to send Force Z, at least in the way that people will be thinking of in terms of the traditional Force Z, because your sole remaining fast capital ship that is operational, truly operational, is King George V. The Germans would still have Tirpitz, and as and when the Scharnhorst get patched up, they would be there as well. You can't oppose Tirpitz and potentially the Scharnhorst, because obviously they don't know, Gneisenau's never coming out of dockyards at that point, with just King George V. And you certainly can't afford to send her away and have nothing. Yes, Duke of York is coming online, but she is still in the process of working up. And if Prince of Wales had been in the lead and been destroyed, I bet you a lot of people would have been blaming, in part, the fact that she was untested and still working up as one of the contributory causes to her destruction. So that means that while, as I detailed in the video I did on the Indian Ocean, up to roughly the Japanese intervention in World War II, the British had been planning repeatedly to send reinforcements to the Indian Ocean and then into the Western Pacific, and had constantly had that batted back by circumstances in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. In this kind of circumstance, you just wouldn't send Force Z. And again, as I detailed in that video, Force Z was supposed to be the vanguard. It was supposed to kind of hold the fort initially, because that's what we can afford to send now, while we gather more forces to send you in a few months. But that's because they could just about extract Prince of Wales and repulse. In this circumstance, they can't. Repulse, as much as she really is not capable of standing up to Tirpitz in a straight-up fight, they might go around and say, well, look, we can at least put her and or Renown with King George V, because we know Renown can face off against a Scharnhorst or two. So, Renown and Repulse plus King George V is at least a decent match for a potential sortie by Tirpitz and the Scharnhorst as and when the latter get out of dock. And that means you can't send Repulse either. Now, obviously, eventually, at some point in the latter part of the year, Hood should theoretically come out if she's being given a relatively quick overhaul. If she's been given a more thorough overhaul, it might be even longer. But she then has to work up and so forth. So, essentially, if Prince of Wales gets destroyed, Force Z isn't going, practically speaking. And if the British send anything, it's going to be in maybe late January, early February 42, once they've managed to bring other ships fully online. Duke of York is more fully online, Hood potentially is back in the fold, etc., etc. If someone insists for whatever reason that you absolutely have to send something more ambitious than some cruisers to try and intimidate the Japanese, for all the good that'll do, then maybe you would switch the emphasis up from being a capital ship-based force, as in a battleship-based force like Force Z historically was, and maybe you send Repulse as the least valuable of your remaining fast capital ships, and base a force around her that's maybe consists of some fast cruisers as well. But at that point, it's not so much a heavy deterrence force, which was the idea of Force Z. It would be more of a capital ship-based fast raiding force, perhaps designed to force the Japanese to deploy the Congos. Because, if you deploy a cruiser squadron, the Japanese can quite easily hunt down and kill that. But if you deploy a cruiser squadron led by Repulse, then yes, the Japanese can hunt down and kill that, but it's going to require significant allocation of fleet assets to do so. Bearing in mind, obviously, at this point, they're not thinking there's Japanese bombers can range out as far as they actually can. Ark Diniz asks, in the top left of the famous photo of HMS Dorsetshire picking up survivors from the Bismarck, there are a line of sailors standing at the railing. These sailors are wearing boots with no laces. Why no laces? I would have expected the British sailors on Dorsetshire would wear laced boots as a matter of workplace health and safety, if for no other reason, since you wouldn't want to trip up while lugging ammunition around. Were they paying some strange homage to the days of sail when bare feet helped grip while climbing the rigging? Or are they Germans who have just been picked up and had their laces confiscated as being potential garrots? It's actually a somewhat more prosaic explanation than that. As you can see, these are the boots that you can see in the top left are not the boots of German sailors. The German sailors that were taken up out of the water, a lot of them didn't have boots on at all, and even those that did, they were generally bundled off further into the ship as quickly as possible. So these are definitely British sailors, but as you can also see, they are standing right at the edge of the ship. So there is a risk, given that the ship is obviously pitching and rolling in the sea, that they might slip and fall. Also, during rescues of sailors, it wasn't uncommon for sailors on the ship that was doing the rescuing to either climb down the ropes or nets partially to help men up, or even to jump into the water to try and help those who were struggling and at the end of their tether, quite literally. And in any of those cases where you may intentionally or accidentally end up in the water, one of the last things you want to be doing is wearing a pair of very heavy boots. So the lack of laces indicates that basically these sailors are prepared for that eventuality, because it means that obviously their feet are protected as long as they stay up on deck, but if they do happen to end up in the water, they can kick, or probably unintentionally, because if you were planning on diving in, you'd probably take your boots off first, but it means you can kick your boots off quickly in the water and thus massively reduce your risk of drowning. Chow Baby asks, I read that Prince of Wales in her final battle had extensive issues with her pom-pom ammunition, for example shells separating from their cartridges prior to being fired, which caused incessant jams. Was this a time period issue or just a poor batch, as I haven't read of the problem before, and did any other ships suffer the same issue in battle? Well, apparently the pom-poms on both Prince of Wales and Repulse did suffer these issues, and there is some indication in the post-battle reports that Prince of Wales had suffered similar issues, but not to the same degree when taking part in operations in the Mediterranean. And of course, the Mediterranean is hotter and more humid than the UK, and the area that Force was operating in is hotter and more humid still than the Mediterranean. And indeed, at the time, there was this cross-correlation. Now, this is, to a fair degree, supposition on my part, because this is more to do with the finer details of cartridged projectiles. So people who are far more familiar with firearms perhaps can chime in and perhaps offer details or alternate suggestions. But looking at the 2-pounder pom-pom ammunition, at least the examples that survive today, versus, say, the 40mm Bofors ammunition, because there was a 40mm Bofors on Prince of Wales that didn't have these problems, I think there are two potential major issues. Firstly is, of course, that the 40mm Bofors doesn't use a massive magazine, so most of the ammunition is going to be in ready-use lockers and then needs to be fed to the gun, whereas, as you can see here, this is actually Prince of Wales's pom-poms, earlier, obviously, the ammunition was sort of exposed on the pom-poms if they were loaded and ready for action. And of course, you would need to keep your AA guns to a certain extent loaded and ready for action for considerable periods. So there would be more opportunity for the elements, particularly heat and humidity, to get at this ammunition if they weren't expending it consistently, as compared to a 40mm pom-pom. But also, when you look at the pom-pom round, the standard anti-aircraft pom-pom round seems to be a very straight cylindrical cartridge, and although the round does have a circular indentation at the bottom for the cartridge to grab onto, the pressing of the cartridge, which obviously allows it to grab onto that, seems, at least again in surviving and photographed examples, to be very minimal. Whereas if you look at the 40mm Bofors round, that is a necked round, so the cartridge is bigger and then necks down to a smaller diameter cylinder, which is what grabs onto the round itself, and generally the pressing indentation on most surviving and photographed 40mm Bofors rounds seems to be somewhat deeper. So to me that would suggest that the 40mm Bofors round, at least compared to the 40mm pom-pom round, possibly had a slightly better grip on its round. That's the brass cartridge had a slightly better grip on it in the first place. And also, because of that necking down, structurally speaking, that is going to resist expansion due to heat slightly more than just a cylinder, or just a plain non-differentiated cylinder. So I think what might have happened is just a mixture of exposure to the elements and to the heat. Bearing in mind, obviously, the round itself is made from a different material to the brass of the cartridge, would have led to differential expansion, which the pom-pom round, would have been less able to resist, and also possibly, because of exposure, maybe a small degree of corrosion starting on the outer faces of the actual round itself, depending on how well sealed it was and so forth. And if the grip was relatively weak and the cylinder was somewhat weaker in being able to resist heat-based expansion, that might, between it all, make the rounds just loose enough that if you start to move them at great speed, like say in the autoloader, it might just be able to separate, whereas the 40mm Bofors round seems to be somewhat better set up to cope with that. The interesting thing, of course, is that later on, the pom-poms don't have this issue in areas like operating in the Pacific, which would suggest that perhaps there was some change in the way that the rounds were manufactured, or possibly it could simply be that maybe when the British Pacific Fleet went out there and the Japanese were constantly attacking it, they were just expending the ammunition quickly enough that ammunition didn't have time to sit out in the open like this for weeks or months on end. But as I say, this would be my supposition just looking at examples and photographs of both surviving and period rounds. But if you happen to know more about how those, the grab collar, I guess you would call it, and the cartridge shape would affect its ability to hold on to its round, because you operate with firearms of varying calibers more often than I do, please let me know in the comments below. Alfred Wilmore asks a slightly odd question. In LEGO, because of the size of the blocks, the guns and the shells have to be of certain sizes because of the limitation of the studs on the blocks. If this applied to the real world, say naval shells could only be produced if they had a radius of 5 centimeters or some multiple of 5 centimeters, how would shells in the age of steam and steel be impacted, and how would major ship types, especially from cruiser and up, be impacted by this restriction? Well, the use of radius instead of diameter means that this actually becomes a lot more of a difficult question, because a radius of 5 centimeters or 50 mil means the total diameter of the shell is 100 mil or 3.9 inch, aka just a fraction under 4 inch. Now, if we're talking about purely shell guns, that's actually quite a useful caliber. 3.9-4 inch, it's a very common destroyer caliber. It shows up quite a lot as anti-aircraft gun caliber on cruisers and so forth. It's superseded by heavier shells on destroyers in the interwar and Second World War period, but apart from perhaps taking a little bit longer to equip torpedo boat destroyers, which initially start off with 3-inch shells, which would be below this size, and smaller than that, to be honest, you're probably okay. Also, early anti-torpedo boat weaponry might suffer in the late ironclad, early pre-dreadnought age, because then you have a lot of 47mm and 57mm and 75 or 88mm shells, none of which would theoretically now be able to be produced. Now, again, if this was diameter we were talking about, then the next jump would be to 150mm or 5.9 inch, roughly 6 inch, again, a fairly useful naval caliber. However, in this case, that's not the case, because if we're talking about radius, well, the next multiple of 5 would be 10, which means total diameter is 20 centimeters, i.e. 200mm, 7.9 inch effectively, just under 8 inch. So you'd be looking at, roughly speaking, 4-inch guns, then 8-inch guns. So that 5-inch and 6-inch caliber, which you see developing as the armament on cruisers in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1900s, 1910s, and as the secondary battery on warships to stop torpedo boats and so forth. That's no longer possible. So secondary batteries and so forth have to be 8-inch, or 7.9-inch, whatever, or 4-inch. I mean, for some mixed batteries on pre-dreadnoughts, that's probably not the world's biggest problem, but it is going to lead to a fairly standard set of calibers. I have a feeling for anti-torpedo boat work, the almost 4-inch is probably going to stick around, because getting the almost 8-inch up to speed in terms of firing is going to be a lot harder. It also means destroyer armament is pretty much capped at the almost 4-inch, because, well, yeah, theoretically you can. In the Cold War period, they did manage to get an 8-inch gun on a destroyer, but not practical for most of the time. Now, interestingly, for battleships, certainly pre-dreadnought and dreadnought battleships, the next step isn't too bad, because the next step obviously would be 5 times 3, 15 centimeters. A radius doubled up is 300, which is 11.8 inches, almost 12-inch, so you're roughly in the ballpark of the 12-inch gun, which was the standard armament for most pre-dreadnoughts and a lot of early dreadnoughts, so no major problems there. And then we step up to the next one, which would be obviously 20 centimeters, radius doubled to 400 millimeters, and that's 15.7 inches. Now that could present something of an interesting quandary, because if you can only manufacture just under 12-inch shells, and your next step is the 15.75-inch, obviously historically we see the 11 and 12-inch guns go to 13.4, 13.5, and 14-inch guns, and then you get 15-inch guns, and then you get 16-inch and 18-inch, and there's this natural progression. If you can't have that natural progression, then you are probably going to see a massive increase in number of almost 12-inch guns. So triple turrets and maybe even quadruple turrets probably developing a lot more widely and a lot more commonly than we see in the original timeline, until such point as probably a quadruple almost 12-inch turret can theoretically then be replaced by maybe a twin 15.75-inch turret, and then there'd be a huge jump from ships with perhaps 16 guns to ships reverting back to 8 guns, but with these much, much larger caliber weapons. And the next jump available after that is, of course, the 25 centimeter doubled to 500 millimeter, which is 19.68-inch, so almost 20-inch guns, and I don't think you'd really see anyone with that, because it would be insane to try and develop. So yeah, you'd basically have 4 fixed calibers, almost 4-inch, almost 6-inch, almost 12-inch, and almost 16-inch. And the 2 higher-end gun calibers pretty much the exclusive provenance of battleships as they develop in size. And then your destroyers are capped at the almost 4-inch, and your cruisers are basically capped at the almost 8-inch, which actually be rather interesting. If everyone was limited to that, you'd have to put a lot more emphasis in trying to get either lots of guns or weird esoteric layouts and armaments for armor, to try and differentiate your ships. New District asks, Drac, I've enjoyed your content for many years. I was watching the Ken Burns series about the American Revolution, and he was careful to point out the 7 Years' War and multiple naval conflicts were important for setting the stage for the Revolution. Have you, or would you consider, covering a naval conflict from the 7 Years' War? And what do you think of Ken's point? Well, I definitely am happy to cover some naval battles from the 7 Years' War. Typically, for an engagement or a war like that, I would want to do a little mini-series like I did for Guadalcanal and so forth, covering the various, at least major engagements sequentially. But, as it turns out, while that may still happen at some point in the future, once I've wrapped up some of my other little mini-series that have been ongoing for quite a while, at the same time, a number of the larger engagements of the 7 Years' War will be covered anyway, because later this year, when I can finally get around to finishing off doing some of the 3D assets for it, I have, as I've mentioned in a previous Drydock, a 3-part video series coming up on Admiral Hawke, who either was part of or led several of the major engagements, including the Battle of Quiberon Bay, seen here, and those are some really, really cool battles, actually, in my opinion. And so yeah, you will definitely see some 7 Years' War battles covered this year. As far as setting the stage for the American Revolution or American War of Independence, yeah, pretty much that is the case. Apart from anything else, even if you want to go by a very simplistic interpretation of the American War of Independence, the whole no taxation without representation, even though it's infinitely more complicated than that. The simple fact of the matter is that the part of the 7 Years' War was the French and Indian War, which took place obviously on the North American continent, and that was a fairly big expense, and a fair number of the taxes that were imposed on the North American colonies, which were then used to justify revolution, because they felt they were unfair, was because of the costs of defending the North American colonies in the French and Indian War. And obviously Britain was trying to make back some of that money. So if the 7 Years' War didn't occur, or at least the French and Indian War element of it didn't occur, Britain is less strapped for cash and perhaps wouldn't see the need to suddenly drop a whole bunch of additional taxes on the 13 colonies, perhaps only a few, and thus the whole flare-up and demand for independence would be somewhat less. In reality, as most people who are students of history know, the baseline causes of the American War of Independence are somewhat more complicated than just the taxation element. One of actually the instigators' major issues wasn't so much the taxation part, but the fact that the British were also cracking down on their highly profitable smuggling activities, but starting a revolution with the common man by saying, hey, the British are stopping me making a bunch of money illegally and I don't like it, is not likely to get you a huge amount of support. Whereas turning around and saying, hey, they're taxing you without representing you, despite the tax burden actually being considerably lower than it was in the UK, and most people in the UK not having democratic representation either. Never mind that, but it sounds a lot better. So, yeah, I mean, in any case, without getting into all of that and the way that some people seem to be weirdly fixated on thinking that George III was some kind of autocratic dictator who supervised the whole thing, the simple fact is that even if you were being incredibly uncharitable to the cause of the American revolutionaries, the French and Indian War, part of the 7 Years' War, caused the expenses that caused the taxes that then became the cause célèbre to, at least in the popular concept, to kick off the American Revolution. So it very much did set the stage for it. Plus, it was actually also a very tough fight for Britain, which meant that that's the 7 Years' War, which meant that everybody was kind of looking to see if they could get one over on Britain, which was one of the reasons why everyone was so keen to join in kicking Britain when the American Revolution kicked off. Kirsten Darkin asks, in your video on the 10th Destroyer Flotilla, you mentioned that the approaching dawn forced HMCS Haida to end her efforts to rescue the crew of HMCS Athabaskan and depart so quickly that her motor cutter was left behind and several crewmen were swept off the rescue netting. What actually happened aboard Haida that led to these events? It feels like a failure to retrieve a boat or allow the crew to get to safety before increasing speed would indicate more urgency than would be implied by just the approaching dawn. And once the ship and cutter were reunited in port, was there any kind of investigation or post-mortem into this incident, or was it just something that was accepted as this happens in wartime? So the circumstances are a little bit convoluted, and I ended up actually having a quick chat with somebody who works on HMCS Haida even now to see what they could offer, because other accounts that I could access were a little bit unclear on things. So what seems to have happened is that by the time Haida got back to the site of the sinking of Athabaskan, it was already technically she was already technically pushing her luck quite a bit, because remember, they're off the German-held coast, and it's not just a case of leave and you're safe. There is a very wide expanse off of the German-occupied coast where you are in significant danger of being attacked by either German ships or German aircraft, potentially German coastal batteries, or all sorts of things, and you're definitely beyond the range of friendly assistance. So you need to actually get a fair distance, a good amount of steaming away to be properly safe. And that takes time. So it's not a case of, well, here comes dawn, now we leave. It's a case of dawn is in X time, we need Y time to get safe, we need to leave, with Y time in place. And technically speaking, they were already in that danger zone. So very technically, they should have left immediately, but of course they weren't going to leave the entire crew of Athabaskan in the water just because technically they were supposed to. There was a little bit of margin. The captain could exercise discretion. You could just step on the gas a little bit if you wanted to get out there, or take a bit more of a risk. But, of course, at the end of the day, Captain de Wolf is responsible for the safety and security of not just his ship, but all the men on his ship as well. So much as he would have liked to hang around and pick up every single Athabaskan crew member in the water, if he did that, and as a result got bombed and sunk 10 minutes later by the Luftwaffe, so now both sets of crews are in the water with no one to rescue them at all, that hasn't really accomplished much. And so his compromise solution was to give Haida's crew 15 minutes to take on as many survivors as humanly possible, and that included lowering the ship's boats. And this was actually a relatively common practice, either to accelerate the rescue of survivors, but also when ships knew that they were perhaps going to be pressed for time. And the boats weren't usually lowered with people on them, because the intention wasn't actually necessarily to pick the boat back up again, or boats. The idea was basically that we'll get as many people on board as possible. We know we're going to have to leave. We know there's probably going to be more people in the water. So if we put boats in the water with food and water in them, and in many cases a means of propulsion, then the survivors we will be forced to leave in the water have something to climb aboard that's better than a Carly float or a raft made of wreckage. If one or two can get on board, they can help their mates on board, and you can stay alive in that boat, especially if it's got a functioning motor, more than long enough in an environment like the Channel to find somewhere more land-like to be safe on. However, of course, Haida's motor cutter was being lowered, and 3 crewmen seemed to have decided, okay, well, instead of just lowering these boats in, we can use the cutter to go around and pick people up who are perhaps either struggling or more distant from the main group of survivors, which is what they were doing. Haida's captain, de Wolf, obviously then his 15-minute margin for picking people up goes past, and they start to tell people, look, we need to get moving, you need to get clear, essentially go to the boats, but we need to keep our ship safe because we're really pushing our luck now. And a couple of minutes later, the ship gets underway. However, obviously, despite both the Athabaskan's crew being told to get clear and Haida's crew, who would have been on the nets, being told to get back up again, some of them were understandably trying to pick up survivors until the absolute last moment, and that meant they were still on the nets when the ship started picking up speed, and over they went. But again, almost Spock-like, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, because if they spent more time there, then there was a rapidly increasing chance that Haida would get sunk and everybody would potentially die. And of course, for the motor cutter, she's quite a distance off from Haida at that point, and the time it would take for her to come back up alongside, sling her up to the davits and haul it up, it just wasn't going to happen. But, as we know, happily, the cutter made it back anyway. 31 Knot Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, asks, there seems to be this widely held belief that attack dog naval officers, the ones who point at the enemy and tell to go nuts, are generally the kind you want to keep at lower levels to prevent them from recklessly endangering valuable resources. To use a well-known example, Iceman became an admiral while Maverick remained a captain. Is there any truth to this belief, and what are the advantages and disadvantages of promoting them to flag rank and higher? There is a certain amount of truth that the kind of attack dog style officers tend to stay at lower levels, but very often this is as much by their preference as anybody else's, because those are the kind of people who really enjoy captaining ships and taking them out to sink other people's ships. And if you tell them, hey, you're a commodore or an admiral or whatever, very often those duties involve a significant amount of time spent ashore, and that's not really why those people are in the Navy. Perhaps if you offered them the position of a commodore of a destroyer flotilla and gave them a destroyer leader and told them, hey, now you can take a whole bunch of destroyers out to attack something, they'd be happy. But if you told them, hey, well, you're a rear admiral, also now, guess what, you're going to have a 2-year posting ashore, they would probably stab somebody at some point out of sheer frustration. So very often they desire the command rather than perhaps the privileges of rank, if that rank doesn't come with being able to be at sea and do things. In some ways, this is almost like the Captain Kirk mentality of that you see in Star Trek, but at the same time, Kirk is a little bit more reserved than most destroyer captains tend to be, even if he does chew the scenery somewhat sometimes. Now, with that said, sometimes if a navy is far-sighted enough, what they'll do is they'll look for some of the attack dog naval officers and look for the ones who perhaps have a multi-level aggression. So the ones who are just as capable of using complex and cunning tactics in their mad dash to sink everybody else, as much as they are just, straightforward, there is enemy, we're going to attack enemy, and we're going to keep attacking the enemy until one of us sinks. And so if you get that kind of very tactically minded officer who's able to outthink the enemy as well as go berserk in attacking them and has the loyalty of his men, then that is the kind of very rare officer that you'd want to promote, because they, at least assuming your navy isn't completely hidebound by tradition and rules, are probably going to make your navy incredibly effective, at least during their tenure in higher levels of command. Or at least they're going to make their section of it very effective. Now, of course, that can lead to a very high-risk, high-reward strategy for said navy, because exactly those same kind of qualities can lead those officers to get into significant personal disputes with other senior officers who perhaps don't see eye to eye to them on the whole sink, burn, and destroy issue. There's a reason I've got Lord Cochrane up here, because, incredibly aggressive, did indeed make flag rank, but so aggressive and driven occasionally to interpersonal conflict that he ended up having to spend some time out of the Royal Navy and, went off and founded a couple of other navies in South America, as well as commanding various other navies in Europe before showing back up again, rejoining the Royal Navy and then being told, yes, we want the Russians dead in the Crimean War, but we don't want them quite that dead. Scott Jennings asks, what are some examples of doctrinal choices by the Axis navies that were objectively better, i.e. more effective or more efficient, than equivalent choices in the Allied navies? There are plenty of examples of Axis doctrinal choices that proved detrimental in the long term, but even a stopped clock is right twice a day. So I'm going to exclude doctrinal and system choices the Axis made specifically because they were being countered or attacked by significant Allied assets, because obviously that's not necessarily a strictly equal set of scenarios. So, for example, German ships had quite extensive radar detection systems. Obviously, Allied ships would also have radar detection systems, but they didn't need them quite as much as German U-boats did, for example, and therefore, unsurprisingly, the Germans kind of forged ahead in that field in a lot of the specific areas surrounding that. So, because that's not a thing that the Allies actually needed as much, I don't think it falls into this category. But I would say the German Wolfpack system for their U-boats probably was a doctrinal choice that, if the Allies had adopted, could have considerably increased their lethality. So you can look at it from two real perspectives. In, let's say, the North Sea, especially in the early part of the war, you have a number of cases where German capital ships, Gneisenau, Lützow, etc., take significant torpedo damage from spreads by British submarines. But when they get hit, the British submarine obviously withdraws because there might be angry escorts in the area, but then the German ship is eventually able to limp into port. Whereas if the British had been operating something akin to the German Wolfpack system, given that they have relatively few targets, if they'd then been able to go, hey, we think there's a German ship in this area, everyone go kill it, or if, say, the submarine that's attacked a German ship goes, hey, well, we found a German pocket battleship and we put a torpedo into it, but we're not sure if it's dead, it's over here, that could potentially have enabled other British subs to home in on the general area and finish them off. And, I mean, okay, at the end of the day, the Kriegsmarine surface fleet wasn't a massive deciding factor in the war, but if, let's say, Lutzow and Gneisenau had been finished off by British submarines in the Norway campaign, that could have had some relatively significant knock-on effects for what else happened later on in the war, at least from a naval surface warfare perspective. And likewise in the Pacific, while obviously the US did eventually adopt a kind of a mini Wolfpack tactic, and the initial portion of the submarine campaign, it probably wouldn't have been of that much use because of the failing torpedoes, but there's kind of a mid part of the war where the US has a decent number of subs, they've mostly fixed their torpedo issues, and Japanese shipping is beginning again to get somewhat sparse, and while the Japanese convoys are nowhere near as large, it's still, the average size Japanese convoy is a little bit big for a single submarine to take on solo and sink most of, except in exceptional cases. So given that, although obviously there were some penetrations of Allied coding by the Axis, I think if the Americans had adopted a German Wolfpack style, even if they maybe only summoned half a dozen boats or something, there could have been some pretty major wipeouts of Japanese convoys. And that would have, helped the war effort somewhat. The Japanese carrier operational doctrine of putting multiple carriers together and then forming big strikes quickly by launching partial deck loads from multiple carriers, that was very much superior to the US carrier system at the time. Theoretically, the British carrier doctrine was actually relatively similar, but between smaller air groups total and the fact that British carriers ended up split across multiple different oceans, they never got a chance to exercise it. So in terms of both choice and implementation, Japanese carrier doctrine, well, everyone else basically adopted it. So that gives you some idea of how objectively better it was. And actually, while we're on the subject of Japan, although the Imperial Japanese Navy having its own fully fledged air force and then the Japanese Army having their own rival air force was perhaps not necessarily a brilliant doctrinal choice overall compared to having a Imperial Japanese Air Force, I do think that having the land-based torpedo bomber, particularly the twin-engine torpedo bomber squadrons that the Japanese Navy managed, was, in the isolated case, actually quite a superior doctrinal choice, because it meant that the Navy had long-distance, heavy torpedo bombers on call pretty much whenever it wanted, integrated with its own striking elements. Now, obviously, you do get Coastal Command torpedo bomber units, RF torpedo bomber units, etc., with aircraft like Beaufighters and Beauforts and so forth in the European theatre, and various torpedo and bombing attempts by the US Army Air Force going on through the Pacific theatre. But I think if the Fleet Air Arm and the US Navy had command of significant twin-engined either fighter torpedo bomber or torpedo bomber assets, along with accompanying fighters, that they could bring to bear in quite a number of situations, there could have been quite a few major upsets compared to what happened historically, like, say, with the Channel Dash. Coneled asks, it's regularly mentioned how different shipyards and manufacturers produce slightly different results in parts, designs for ships are regularly modified from one class to another member to another. What's the closest two ships have come to being exactly identical to each other, down to every rivet, bolt, weld, the composition of all the materials in every measurement? While I don't know the precise answer, I would say that probably one of the most likely candidates is going to be the Casablanca-class escort carriers, as you can see here, simply because, as you note, when ships are being built in the same class, very often it's over the span of multiple years, so there'll be minor design changes going forward, so there can be supply issues, and then again, as you said, shipyards and manufacturers all have their own little ways of doing things. Whereas, as you can kind of see from this picture, when they were building the Casablanca class, they're all coming from the same shipyard, they're all being built to the same plans, they're all being built by the same workforce, they're actually almost all of them are being built at roughly the same time, literally right next to each other, with mass-manufactured, batch-ordered components. So even more so than things like Fletcher-class destroyers and Flower-class corvettes, which, while they are built in very large numbers, are still being built over several years and in multiple different yards. I think something that's just built en masse almost all at the same time, like the Casablancas, are probably going to end up with the two ships that are the closest to being functionally identical to each other. Stéphane Pirot asks, in what I read about Souchon's daring raid dash across the Mediterranean, it seems most of the course of action was taken and decided by Souchon himself. Considering the consequences for the Central Powers should he have failed, wasn't that a very big political responsibility for an admiral? And what do you think it would have meant for the Mediterranean and the Black Sea theatre if he had failed? Yes, technically Souchon did take on a huge amount of responsibility by making the major decisions most of the time when it came to Goeben and Breslau. However, he didn't really have all that much of a choice. You see a similar thing with von Spee and the East Asia Squadron, simply because at the time, yes, it's World War I, everyone thinks, oh yeah, all high modern technology, first modern major war, etc. Communication at sea is still in a relatively primitive period, especially when it comes to communicating with ships at sea from land. Because if you want to communicate with a ship at sea, whereas in World War II, very often you would be able to just fire up a radio and go, hey, hello, I'm talking to you, and get a reply. In World War I, radio sets just weren't capable of that at any kind of significant range. So if you wanted to communicate with a ship that was far away, not in your own port or not very close to your own port, what you would have to do is work out roughly where that ship was or was likely to be. You would then have to send the message that you wanted to, have that ship follow to the nearest port, which had a German diplomatic operative there and who had access to either civilian or their own fairly high-power radio transmitter set and would be allowed to use it. And then they would have to transmit repeatedly, basically just as a general broadcast, and hope that they were right about where the ship was and that it would pick up and the orders and respond to them. Or, if a ship came into port, then obviously they could request orders directly and maybe say, hey, in the next week we'll be over here. But even that was somewhat complicated in the Mediterranean because, of course, the British had severed or tapped pretty much all the telegraph cables which would take information round to various places. The Germans did have some options in that obviously the British couldn't sever telegraph cables running directly from Germany to Italy or Austria, but Italy had declared neutrality. And even then, even assuming that you can get messages to a port in Italy or Austria-Hungary and find somebody who's willing to let you use a radio transmitter to broadcast, you have no real idea where Goeben is. And the additional problem is, of course, once you start transmitting, there's a chance that the Allies will pick you up and go, well, if he's transmitting orders to Goeben in this area, assuming they don't know where she is at that point, well, now we know where she is and we can go and wait for her and track her down in that area. So it's all very uncertain and all very difficult. And if Souchon is doing his level best to make himself scarce and evade the Allies, that also means he's evading most predictions of where he's going to be. And that means your ability to communicate with him is extremely limited. I mean, both sides during the Goeben-Breslau chase very often resort to literally just pulling over civilian ships and going, hey, you were in port in the last few days. Mind giving us an update on what the newspapers are saying is going on? And that was for major things like, are we at war with this country yet or not? So at that point, much like back in the Age of Sail, but even more so, the senior officers aboard various ships, including Souchon, they have to be picked to be men who can make these kinds of decisions, even if they are the kind of decisions which might cause significant wars. you make sure you promote people you trust, essentially. And if he'd failed, let's say Goeben gets interned, or it gets crippled and or sunk, basically doesn't make it to the Dardanelles, there's a possibility the Ottomans might still enter the war on Germany's side. They do have a secret military alliance with them after all, which they signed before the war. But the arrival of Goeben and Breslau is very commonly seen as a major precipitating event. So if that doesn't happen, if the Ottomans stay neutral, then obviously the Gallipoli landings don't happen. The Anzac Corps probably gets deployed to the Western Front, and all the effort that was poured into Gallipoli probably gets poured into the Western Front as well. Or possibly someone has a bright idea of trying to conduct some kind of amphibious landing in the Adriatic to help out the Italians later on, if the Anzacs arrive a little bit later. Of course, initially the Italians are neutral, so that's not really a problem. But if you end up with, well, hey, there's a whole bunch of potential landing sites in Europe, and we've just shown up with an entire sea-mobile corps of men, statistically speaking, they're probably just going to get fed into the Western Front meat grinder, but there are a number of remote but still plausible possibilities of the Anzac Corps being deployed somewhere else in Europe trying to effect some kind of significant change. I mean, heck, the Allies came close a few times to dropping people off behind the German lines on the Western Front. And, well, if the Anzac Corps rocks up in Portsmouth or Liverpool with all these ships, and you've got, all the pre-dreadnoughts and so forth that were otherwise committed to Gallipoli to hand, might as well give it a shot. Nietwiec of Gdansk asks, you often mention in your videos the uselessness of Japanese 25mm cannon. Were the Japanese aware of their poor effectiveness? If so, when did this happen? And what steps did they take to introduce better cannon? I've heard they tried to copy the 40mm Bofors or license the German 5cm. How much truth is there in that? I'm trying to build a hypothetical A150 battleship, and assuming it entered service around mid-46, what light cannons should I arm her with? Would it still be a version of the 25mm, maybe supported by rockets, like Issei and Hyuga? Or what if there had been no war and they just straight up entered service in 46 without the pressures of war? So, despite the fact it was objectively quite a terrible gun for the Pacific War, the 25mm wouldn't have been an awful weapon in 38, 39, something like that. And, heck, to be fair, compared to some anti-aircraft guns, it had some advantages. It didn't stop working every 15 seconds like the 1.1 inch. And unlike the German 37mm, you didn't have to hand load the blasted thing every time you fired a shot, which, you did have to change the magazines every 15 rounds, but that's 15 times more than the 37mm. But the sudden rapid advances in aircraft technology caught Japan out as much as almost everybody else. And while they were perfectly happy to take advantage of those sudden rapid advances when it came to their own aircraft, it meant that while something like, say, the Devastator could be torn apart pretty comprehensively, anything with more performance than the Devastator, so the Dauntless, the Avenger, later the Helldiver, or indeed a blancmange catapulted off the deck of a US carrier, to be perfectly frank, was a significantly more difficult target. And as US planes obviously got faster, more agile, and tougher, the downsides of the 25mm became apparent rather quickly. And it's not just the gun itself, it's also the lack of advanced aiming systems, the lack of remote fire control systems, power operation, all these other things that especially would go into some of the heavier Allied anti-aircraft guns that would help them out, didn't really help out on the 25mm because they weren't introduced. And even by 43, obviously, you see the Allies supplementing the 20mm Oerlikon with the 40mm Bofors, in part because of the significantly greater range and stopping power that it had. The Japanese don't really introduce that kind of what I would term medium anti-aircraft gun. They just stick with the 25 and then 3 and 5 inch guns. Now, that's not to say the Japanese weren't aware of its shortcomings. They were, I think, aware by late 42, early 43. They were certainly beginning to get an idea that maybe this isn't the best light anti-aircraft weapon on the planet. However, by that point, they are in the middle of a war, and they face the rather significant issue of they can produce an awful lot of these things. They have the production line up and running, and it is running. Oh boy, is the 25mm production line running. So they kind of take the approach of, well, we can maybe make up for the individual lack of performance by just having loads of them, and they therefore install loads of them. But fundamentally, they face the issue of we don't really have a replacement in hand, and to design and build one or copy one will take quite a while, quite a lot of time and resources. Then we've got to get a production line built and up to speed. Can we do all of that in time, and how much is that going to impact the production of more 25mm in the interim? And so, yeah, they obviously get their hands on some copies of the Bofors, and they do look at various other anti-aircraft guns as potential replacements. But it's just a case of too much time, too much money, too much effort compared to we need lots of AA guns and we need them now. And so therefore, a lot of a mediocre gun is better than some better anti-aircraft guns in 6 months' time. Now, assuming you've got this hypothetical A150, if the A150 is entering service in mid-46, if the war has gone on until the historic end of the war, or the war has lasted into 46, it's going to be triple 25mm mounts and some singles, because that's all Japan is making, and that's all they're likely to make. And yeah, you probably will have a lot of anti-aircraft rocket launchers on there as well, for light AA. However, if you're talking about the war hasn't started by 46 and the A150s are entering service, I think by that point, very definitely the Japanese would have found something better. Probably license built. I suspect maybe even a version of the later German 37mm AA, because believe it or not, the Germans did eventually realise that the original 37mm AA, the single shot that they're using, isn't perhaps the best weapon, and they do eventually come up with an automatic one, which isn't half bad, all things considered. And I think the Germans quite happily would have traded that or licensed it to the Japanese in exchange for something that the Japanese had that would be quite useful for them. And so I would say that would probably be the primary light medium AA armament if there hadn't been a war until 46. Maybe the Japanese would have got some flak veerlings off the Germans as well. Gabriel A. Hawkins asks, what was the last battleship or battlecruiser design that had a realistic chance of being completed, and what do you think of that design? I.e., while the Montanas weren't laid down, there was certainly a universe of possibilities where they could have been, and it was heavily considered, so the Montanas would perhaps qualify. I'm guessing it's probably a Soviet design that would have been laid down if Stalin survived, but maybe there's a British possibility as well. Yeah, I think if you want to go by latest design, as in what would have been the last battleship or battlecruiser class hull to enter service, probably something Soviet, maybe the Stalingrads. You can kind of see what was left of Stalingrad here. But that would be largely because if Stalin somehow survives, assuming he doesn't just purge the naval design bureaus on a random whim at some point, it will be a case of Comrade Stalin says you will get these capital ships into service, or Comrade Stalin will execute you, or send you to Gulag, or execute you and send your body to Gulag. But, well, if you've seen my post-World War II battleship designs video, you'll know what I think of those particular interesting design choices. I think outside of that, I would say the other two designs that potentially realistically had a chance of being laid down and completed would be actually not the Montanas, because the Montanas, yes, they could have been completed, but they were started in the middle of World War II and then cancelled. But some of the potential suggested reworks for Illinois and Kentucky, the 5th and 6th Iowa class, I think in some universes there's a relatively realistic chance of those being completed. How long they last in service is another matter, but when you look at some of the horrible aesthetic abominations that were created by refitting US cruisers and how long they lasted in service as missile cruisers, given the considerably greater hull volume and therefore flexibility of an Iowa-class hull turned into a missile ship, as well as obviously its potential role as a command ship, etc., and a flagship. I think the Iowa missile ships, perhaps as most famously exemplified by that hypothetical painting done of the Kentucky, would certainly be up there as potential candidates. And I think particularly if ships like the Stalingrad had been completed, there is an outside chance, and admittedly a very small one, but an outside chance, it's not sub 1%. We're talking about maybe somewhere between the 5 and 20% possibility that Britain might have built some additional class of battlecruiser or battleship to oppose them, because again, if referencing the post-World War II battleship design video I did, while the British did go really ham on some of the really big, fast, with looking at ridiculous levels of armour type designs, they did also look at a smaller, faster, more economical, almost, I think I termed it British Richelieu style battleship, which would have been more than capable of dealing with the Stalingrads. And the only reason I say I can see that if the Stalingrads had been built coming in is because some of the King George V's would have been quite heavily worn by wartime use, and whatever else you might want to say about them, they were sub 30 knot ships by a reasonable margin. And if the Stalingrads are running around, you can bring out an old worn ship that can't catch them, but could kill them if they were dumb enough to stumble into it. And that's not really a great option. Vanguard is more what you want, but there's only one of her, and she is still a compromised design choice. And so at that point, I can see somebody going, okay, well, how about we scrap all the King George V's quickly, early, and we build this new high-speed, all-forward, quad-turreted, 2 quad-turret forward, 40,000 ton fast battleship, and we'll keep Vanguard on strength for the minute, and then these will be our new ships. And heck, at that point, I can even see some people advocating to repurpose the quadruple turrets off the King George V's, either just directly with 14-inch guns or reworking them slightly with 15-inch guns. And yeah, those might be the last battleship - battle cruisers, especially because with the all-forward armament, there'd be a great temptation to put a huge helicopter deck and or missile rack on the back. GFDX asks, port facilities. For a port in the time period of World War I and II, what is most of the stuff you'll need to build if you want one, from obvious things like fuel and munitions depots to the less obvious? Book recommendations very welcome as an answer, as I'm aware this is otherwise a whole series of videos. Okay, so assuming that you're building a military port, you have, broadly speaking, I'd say one of two choices. You're either building what I would term a rear echelon port, so that is a port that is supporting the fleet by constructing ships, fitting out new ships, refitting ships, repairing ships, and sending them back out to the front lines. So for the US, that would be pretty much all the continental US ports, and Pearl Harbor later on in the war. And then you also have forward operating ports. So that would be places like New Caledonia, Espiritu Santo, and later places even like Guam or Ulithi. And for places in the UK or Europe, those ports are generally kind of one and the same because the enemy tends to be kind of right over there. So you will have slight differences depending on which of those ports you're building. But if we were to assume that you were going to build a generic multi-purpose port, maybe something like Pearl Harbor that could be both a fallback position and a frontline port, Portsmouth or something like that, then, well, as you said, you've got the obvious things. You need your fuel depots and you need your munition depots, and those have to be protected. Ideally, you want your fuel farms to be broken up by berms. Obviously, if you're using oil tanks, if it's coal, just put it all in a big pile or several big piles. Doesn't make too much odds. Your munition depots obviously need to be dug into bunkers, separated, hopefully maybe even disguised a little bit, and kept away from other things, because don't put your munition bunker next to your fuel farm, because if one of them goes up, you don't want your day ruined even more by the other one going up. On top of that, you're going to need all other sorts of storage facilities. You need storage for spare parts for ships, both to be issued with and to be refitted with. You need storage for food, both cold storage and dry storage. You also need some form of refrigerated storage for things that of a liquid nature, especially obviously if you're in the Royal Navy, and even in the US Navy, there's certain liquids that perform much better when they are stored cold until issued to ships. You need warehouses for repair equipment because things are going to come in broken and you are going to need to fix them. So you're going to need storage areas, not necessarily always warehouses, but certainly at least large open flat areas, and ideally some warehouses as well, for equipment that's being cycled to and from ships, stuff that's broken that needs repairs, stuff that's being taken off and being replaced, stuff that's being shipped in to be put on, so things like light anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, torpedo launchers, because the torpedoes obviously will be in the munition stores. You're going to need admin and inventory to keep track of all this. You're also going to need warehouses for things like crew uniforms, blankets, bedding, hammocks, cutlery, crockery, all of those sorts of things to, so the crew can actually operate. Small items like binoculars, instruction manuals, training manuals. You're going to need a light railway or possibly even a full-scale railway system to move a lot of this bulk stuff around. As you can see here, there's a nice little saddle tank engine right in the middle here. You're going to need dry docks for repairing ships. You're going to need berthing for ships that don't need as heavy repairs or ships that are just putting in to resupply. You're going to need mobile cranes and maybe some fixed cranes for the dry docks as well. But the mobile cranes, which can move around on rails, are really useful because you can put them where you need them to be rather than ships over in that berth and the cranes over on this berth. And speaking of berths and fixed cranes, you are going to need some heavy fixed cranes over water berths as well for things like fitting out or stripping off heavily damaged equipment or installing new heavy equipment when you can't really spare the dry dock space. You're going to need tugboats, you're going to need pilot boats, you're going to need diving boats, not as in boats that dive, those are called submarines, but you're going to need boats to support diving equipment and divers when they're going down to repair vessels and so forth. By World War II, you're probably going to need a nearby airfield, both for transport and for fighter protection, and somewhere to debark your carrier air groups. If there's a chance the enemy's going to attack you, then you're going to need air raid shelters. You're going to need potentially coastal batteries. At the very least, you're going to need anti-aircraft guns. And as I said, your airfield might need to support fighters. Therefore, you probably also want radar, perhaps even dedicated anti-aircraft ships. You're going to need a plan of defense against submarines, so submarine nets, minefields, mine layers, mine sweepers, small patrol craft, net tenders to open and close the nets when ships are coming in and out, possibly seaplane facilities, barracks, exercise areas, sports facilities, hotels, entertainment facilities, extremely large cafeterias or messes, secure areas for planning and classified intelligence briefings and so forth, some form of communications hub to communicate with ships at sea and to receive orders from elsewhere inland. And of course, you're going to need good transport connections inland to cities, industry, etc., etc. So yeah, and that's just some of the highlights, I think. If you put all of that in place, you'll have a fairly decent port, and then you can start discovering all the fine details of how to make it all work together. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, while I know you don't focus on modern technology, I'd appreciate your historian's take on a recent suggestion I saw, namely that long-range land-based cruise missiles and related attack drones could be considered a modern form of Jeune Ecole strategy. Would simply substituting such weapons in place of a swarm of torpedo boats actually allow such a strategy to function in the modern era? My curiosity is not so much on the technical capabilities of modern weapons as their applicability to historical doctrine. I think if someone was to develop the appropriate methods of implementation, there is a possibility there for attack drones to maybe be seen as a version of the Jeune Ecole. I don't think long-range land-based cruise missiles really are. I think the long-range anti-shipping missile based on land is more like coastal defense batteries, because those came in both heavily fortified fixed launchers and in more mobile forms. But the main thing with the Jeune Ecole is it proposes vast swarms of attack craft which have the ability to deny the sea to the enemy by going out and making calculated attacks at key strategic points by, looking at the situation, going, right, here is the best opportunity, this is the best vector, and they have the choice, obviously, if the situation isn't right, to break off and come back and try another time. And obviously being very highly mobile. Even mobile cruise missile systems aren't really that mobile compared to ships and aircraft trying to hunt them down, much the same way as coastal defense batteries back in the period of the Channel covers. They're mobile, but if you've really ticked off a light cruiser or something and they have a scout aircraft that can spot you, you're going to very rapidly discover that no matter how fast your truck is, it ain't faster than a 6-inch shell. But in theory, if you had a swarm of attack drones that had a decent range and either payload, in the case of some of the larger ones, or themselves, they are the payload, so kind of almost one-way drones, but which have, again, decent loiter range and a reasonable sensor package, those could definitely be considered a form of the Jeune Ecole, especially if they have the ability to operate both autonomously and semi-autonomously, i.e. They kind of launch, they take care of guiding themselves to the relevant target area, but they can still feed back to a ground control station who can then make decisions for them, as well as their onboard decision-making, up to and including a recall if they decide it's not the right time. Whereas I think most modern drones, quote-unquote, are really just cheap propeller-driven versions of a cruise missile. They look very much like some of the early anti-shipping missiles, except more propeller, less jet or rocket. Whereas if you as I said, if you had a slightly more advanced version that either had landing gear or a catching device or something, and could head out and, as I say, decide whether or not it's a good time to attack, or the decision can be made for it, assuming that there's not too much jamming present, that would be more like a torpedo boat. And therefore would be a lot more like the Jeune Ecole, because you could theoretically still mass produce these things in vastly larger numbers than aircraft, manned aircraft, say on a carrier. Probably, at least at the lower end, produce them for significantly less than things like big, expensive surface-to-air missiles, and therefore, large numbers, relatively low cost for ability to dictate when and where you strike, and the ability to essentially call it off until almost the last minute, as well as intelligent positioning, such as, launch a mass swarm, but the swarm circles around and attacks from multiple vectors at once. That kind of thing would definitely represent a modern Jeune Ecole strategy, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think anyone has quite managed to strike that balance of cost versus capability yet with either drones with their own payload or dedicated attack drones that are the payload. Christopher Villenfort asks, I've missed a few months, so I hope it's okay with a double portion question. Sure. So, the Sverige class. There are several alternate versions for it. Do you think one of the other versions would be better? And if you had all the money from the collection, about 15 million Swedish crowns compared to the 10 million that Sverige cost, how would you construct Sverige with full hindsight? So, looking at the various options that were considered for the Sverige class, I think of those options, they chose pretty much the best one. My eye was drawn to some options that had twin 12-inch instead of twin 11-inch, but those options were also somewhat smaller than the design they actually decided to go for, because in part they had thinner armour than the options that were finally chosen, and a number of them were also somewhat slower, which isn't brilliant. So the F design, which is the basis of the Sverige class, it's got pretty much the joint highest top speed with most of the other designs. It's got a pretty decent armament, and it's one of the best protected. I mean, yes, it costs a bit, but the options that have a limited battery of 494mm guns, which are 7.6-inch guns, I don't think that would have been a good idea, because you'd have a considerably smaller secondary battery by numbers, and you may start to run into issues with shell splashes being similar to the main battery. I think the 6-inch battery as an anti-torpedo boat battery and as a supporting fire battery is a much better choice. Now, if I had a 50% larger budget and I was allowed full hindsight, so I've got a 15 million crown budget instead of 10, how would I change the layout that you see here? Well, I would need a slightly larger vessel, and you'll see why in a minute, but bearing in mind that this ship is designed pre-World War I. So, yes, I have hindsight, but I'm not going to apply full, like, oh yeah, by the way, these ships are also going to need to stand up against the Kriegsmarine in World War II hindsight. It would be more a case of applying, well, this, for the extra money, could have built you a somewhat better ship at the time hindsight. So, somewhat longer vessel, but improving the length to beam ratio. So while beam increase will be a factor, there's going to be a proportionally greater length increase. That's going to let me have a bit more machinery, so that I can push the speed up to maybe 23.5, 24 knots or so. And with the additional length, I'm going to make a few changes to the armament. So instead of having, as you can see here, we've got one super-firing twin 6-inch turret over the forward 11-inch guns, and then we have 6 singles. So we have a total broadside of 5 6-inch guns on either side, out of a grand total of 8 guns. I would actually duplicate that super-firing twin 6-inch aft. And then that means I can delete a pair of wing turrets. So maybe delete the aft pair of wing turrets in exchange for the twin turret. And then because now I can bring those 2 guns to bear on either side, that means I can delete another pair of wing turrets and still maintain my 5-gun salvo. So maybe the forward pair of wing turrets goes. And then because I'll have a little bit more beam compared to the historic Spherias, I think maybe dead amidships, where you've got the final pair of single 6 inches, I think I would maybe upgrade those to another set of twin turrets. So I'd actually retain my 8 guns in essentially a diamond layout of twin turrets, but now I have a 6-gun broadside instead of a 5-gun broadside and considerably more deck space available on either side. And to be honest, because I get to fill in those divots where the fore and aft single 6 inches were, I've also got a decent amount of upper deck space. So with this, initially, I would put a considerably larger 12-pounder anti-torpedo boat battery, because then that means I can engage with my 11-inch guns against big targets. I've got my 6-inch guns to engage cruisers and large destroyers, but small torpedo boats and destroyers as well, I can engage with my extensive 12-pounder battery. I could also then either save weight or improve main armour protection by deleting that 4-inch strake that you can see, which historically protects the single guns, because as with the forward gun that you can see here, I can just have distinct armoured barbettes. And then, as I say, either that makes the ships lighter and cheaper, allow me to put money elsewhere, or I can perhaps increase the main belt a bit. Now, it might also be tempting with increased length and slightly more beam to maybe see if I can upgrade the twin 11s to triple 11s to significantly increase my firepower, or maybe to have the super firing 6-inch forward and twin 6 inches amidships, and then maybe cut down the aft superstructure and have another twin 11-inch. I don't think I'd go for super firing twin 11s, but either way, either one of those options would get me a 6-gun salvo, but that may be pushing it a bit too far cost-wise, and almost certainly is going to slow me back down again. So essentially I would have a faster, better armoured version of the Spherias with a slightly heavier but slightly better laid out secondary battery, and as well as an increased anti-torpedo boat battery, and maybe, depending on the budget, maybe an extra couple of main guns, but I'd put that last one under a big question mark. The advantage of all this is that when it comes time to refit them in the interwar period, you've got a diamond layout of secondary guns, which could then either be upgraded or possibly replaced by dual-purpose weapons, giving you now 6 heavy AA guns, which can also take out torpedo boats and destroyers. And with the large amounts of clear space on the superstructure and on the sides of the ship, There's plenty of spaces to put plenty of Bofors 40mm guns, or Bofors 20mm, or Bofors 25mm, or indeed Bofors anything anti-aircraft guns, which will make these ships very lethal defending against air attacks. They've still got pretty hard-hitting punch against smaller attack craft like destroyers, and they still have their either 4 or 6 big guns and decent armour to take on cruisers and potentially even small capital units. Richard Hsu asks, it looks like during World War II, all US admirals who died at sea were buried at sea. Was this the norm for all navies during World War I and World War II, or did different navies have different policies regarding at-sea burial for senior officers? It wasn't universal, even in the US Navy. For example, Admiral Moon, who committed suicide aboard his ship, is actually buried in Arlington, so his body was transported back to the US. A lot of it is, to a certain extent, expediency, because generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, when an admiral dies at sea, especially in World War I and World War II, it tends to be in action. And therefore, either there isn't a body to bury because they've gone down with their ship, like, say, Admiral Hood aboard HMS Invincible, or Admiral Kidd on Arizona, or the ship itself has been very heavily damaged and needs repairs, and is very far away from home. And at that point, you've got several things to consider. Firstly, yes, technically you could try and preserve the body perhaps in one of the cold stores in the ship, but one or more of those cold stores may not be operational. Two, those cold stores are going to be needed for other things, like storing food and so forth, and people probably won't take too kindly to having their potential dinner sharing space with a dead guy. Then you've also got the fact of, to a certain extent, showing solidarity. Back in the Age of Sail, yes, you could do for a particularly beloved admiral something a little bit outlandish, like pickling him in brandy and transporting him home, like what happened with Nelson. But if everyone else in the attack that also happened to kill the admiral is being buried at sea, because you can't store them all in the cold stores, then in as much a show of solidarity with the others as much as anything else, the admiral is most likely going to also be buried at sea. Now, on occasion, there may be very specific cultural or religious reasons, either on a national basis or on a personal basis, where a body may want to be recovered back to the home country. But even then, there is still going to be a certain degree of expediency going on, because, okay, if an admiral dies of, let's say, some shrapnel wounds, and they're on their way back from an Arctic convoy, and they're a couple of days out of arriving back home, that might be a case for keeping the body around and preserving it as best you can so that you can give it back to the family. But if you're on the other side of the Pacific, you're weeks of sailing away from the continental United States, and they haven't left any particular express wishes to the contrary. Indeed, a lot of career sailors probably would find it quite fitting to be buried at sea anyway. Then you are going to commit them to the deep pretty much as soon as you can organise the burial party. But the thing is, when you tabulate the number of flag officers on all sides who actually died at sea in World War I and World War II, the vast majority of them tended to go down with their ship or got, liberally distributed in such a way that you didn't really need to worry about burial. Eric Van Dooting asks, a couple of the rare instances in which the Mark 13 torpedo actually worked in 1942 were when attacks were made against Japanese light carriers, Shoho and Ryujo in particular. Was this due to luck, overclaiming, or some more explanatory factor? Some of it's down to luck because, the Mark 13 had a lot of problems. It didn't mean it never worked, but it rarely worked. But if you throw enough torpedoes at a problem, statistically some of them at least are going to work. And there is actually a little bit of overclaiming going on, because when you look at the American records from the various Devastator pilots, they claim considerably more hits than the Japanese say that Shoho received. And to be fair, Shoho did sink pretty quickly, But I have a feeling that had as much to do with the well over 12,000-pound bombs that were chucked into her as much as the 7 or possibly more torpedoes. And those are the torpedoes that everyone acknowledges hit and actually detonated. As I said, the Americans claimed they scored considerably more hits. The Japanese say no. Some of that could be overclaiming. Some of that could be torpedoes that were seen to run straight and true into the ship and then just failed to do all that much. And even of the 7 that everyone agrees hit, how much damage they did, did they detonate fully? Did they detonate partially? Did they detonate, in a way that mitigated their damage somewhat? Someone would have to go and poke around the wreck of Shoho, assuming it's intact enough to make that kind of determination. But also, poor old Shoho, well, as you can see in this picture, was not exactly the most heavily escorted of ships. So she did have some protection, but if ever there was going to be a carrier that you could hit with not quite practice conditions, but close to, it would have been poor old Shoho. And with Regia, bear in mind, again, she was hit by just the one torpedo, but multiple 1,000-pound bombs. And she was a relatively lightly constructed and somewhat unstable vessel to begin with. So the fact that one good torpedo hit to her machinery spaces, plus a bunch of bombs and fires, and the fact that she had to maneuver with a gaping hole in her machinery for a while to try and evade further attack, I mean, that I'd expect a ship like that to go down at that point. So, yeah, one working Mark 13 certainly helped sink her, but the bombs also really did as well. Andrew Dederer asks, with the move to iron and later steel hulls, it looks like metal, aka leak-proof bulkheads, came in at almost the same time. Did these require an iron hull to connect to? After about what year can we consider a ship's internal form to be a kind of ice cube tray format? And when did warships begin to increase subdivision beyond civilian norms? So, bulkheads did exist on some wooden ships, to varying degrees. However, there were quite significant limitations to them because wooden ships' hulls flexed a lot. Now, notice I said a lot, because even iron and steel ships flex, as anyone who's been on a large ship in any kind of active sea will tell you. However, they flex considerably less compared to wooden hulls. And of course, if you have a bulkhead, which is a fixed flat plane, hopefully, and it's in a frame, almost either literally or the hull as acting as a frame, which is flexing, then either you're going to create a lot of stress concentrations, which is bad for the ship, or you're going to end up with seams opening up. And of course, that's assuming the bulkhead acts as a rigid item. Of course, if the bulkhead is made of wood because it's in a wooden ship, then the bulkhead is also going to warp and bend. So essentially, you can have a bulkhead that sort of will somewhat delay flooding, but is not going to actually be watertight. It's just going to, as I said, slow things down. Whereas once you get to iron ships, then you can have proper bulkheads, because as I said, the iron ships' hulls, they tend to flex a little bit less, and you do have fairly rigid sections like frames and major beams where you can install bulkheads, and the iron bulkhead itself is also therefore less likely to flex. And the reason I've got a picture of Nemesis here in a gale is because Nemesis was one of the ships with the very first true bulkheads aboard, because she was one of the very first iron warships. Now, in terms of what year can we consider a ship's internal form to be almost like an ice cube tray, lots of subdivision, it's a very moving target. As I said, Nemesis is a warship. She's not a naval warship. She doesn't belong to a navy, as in a state navy. She belongs to the Honourable East India Company. I always think that first word is a little bit of a dark joke, but there you go. And so she has bulkheads, but it's not, it's not quite ice cube as in here's regular subdivisions. Once you get the ability to have bulkheads, you do start to get division, but it's going to be more on the order of, well, we divided the fore and aft sections into some, if we're talking about warships at least, into some segregated compartments, because obviously those, certainly initially, are the unarmoured sections. So if they take hull damage, we don't want the whole thing to flood immediately. But then internal to the citadel, sometimes the entire citadel would essentially be just one big block, and there would be some internal subdivision, just because it was easier to do, keeping the engine separate from the boilers and so forth. But whether or not that constituted a true watertight bulkhead or just an easy way of saying this is this room, that's that room, very much depended on the ship and the layout of things. But pretty quickly, warships increased their subdivision well beyond civilian norms, because as soon as you could have bulkheads, well, if you think about a warship, you're going to have the coal bunkers. They need to be obviously separate, as do the engine rooms, as do the boiler rooms, possibly multiple boiler rooms, which is going to be the same on a civilian ship. But then you've also got the magazines. They need to be separated off. You've got a lot more crew accommodation. That needs to be separated off from places like the officers, the mess, bathing areas, storage areas for non-magazine items, small arms, hammocks, etc. So subdivision on warships very rapidly increases, because it makes sense to subdivide all these areas anyway, and while you're at it, you might as well put in a bunch of watertight bulkheads. Whereas, obviously, on a merchant ship, it's got much smaller crew, and they're looking for economy, which means very big open cargo holds. So the change is pretty much instant. Peter Dasso asks, if either one of the two sides at Jutland had only battleships and battlecruisers with an all-forward gun layout, would that have changed their tactics in any way? Possibly, although it very much depends on the exact nature of the all-forward layout. So if you've got an all-forward layout, kind of like Nelson here, where you have not all turrets able to bear dead forward, that's going to influence things slightly differently as compared to if you did something like Richelieu, where every turret can bear in the entire forward arc all the time. Because obviously that opens up possibilities to charge headlong and you still have all your firepower. Whereas with Nelson, you can charge almost headlong, but you do have to be at a slightly off bearing to get all your guns to bear. Now, would it have changed the overall battle tactics of fighting in a line of battle? Probably not as a whole, because if you exploit the greatest advantage of an all-forward armament, the ability, as I said, to charge forward with most or all of your guns to bear, you are also running headlong into torpedoes, which were a major concern for both sides. However, the other thing you've got to remember about a line of battle is it's also about controlling the range to the enemy, which obviously, you don't want to get too close where both sides can blast through each other's armor. What you want to do is ideally sit at a range where your guns can punch through their armor and their guns can't punch through your armor. And whether you do that with having bigger guns than the enemy or having more armor than the enemy, obviously that's up to various design choices. But in those circumstances, a line of battle still makes a fair degree of sense. However, when it comes to specific maneuvers within the battle, then you could see some significant changes in tactic. For example, the German battle turnaway, the sort of 180 and disappear, you can maintain a certain degree of covering fire with conventional ship designs because, of course, you'll always have guns able to fire in all arcs, just maybe not all of them. Whereas if you have an all-forward design, there is going to be a blind spot aft. So that may influence perhaps how quickly you want to do that turn, or potentially it might influence how you design your ship, how agile you make it, because you might really want to be able to flip through that blind arc as fast as humanly possible. And of course, at some point while you're making that turn, if you want to re-engage with your guns as you come about, you will probably have to disengage and start swinging the guns around. And when you look at, say, for example, Jellicoe's maneuver, when the Germans send a mass torpedo attack against him, turning away from that, presenting your stern so narrow target, minimizing the rate of closure so you've got maximum maneuvering time, all of that makes a lot of sense. However, if all your main guns are up front, there will be a temptation, especially when people are setting doctrine earlier before the war, to try and address a torpedo attack by turning towards the torpedoes, because you're still presenting a very narrow angle. Now, it does give you less reaction time for the torpedoes themselves, and it's more guaranteed that you're going to actually cross paths with them rather than maybe running them out of fuel. But it also means that your armament being projected against the enemy really isn't that much reduced, so it might fit a more aggressive ethos and might be quite attractive. But another tactical change that might ensue is the German battlecruisers, because they know that they're at a range disadvantage compared to their British counterparts. If you've got your armament all forward, the temptation to close that range a lot more quickly by pointing your bow on an intercept course with the enemy is going to be there, as opposed to more gradually edging in so that you can still have a full broadside going. But all of this also has to be predicated on the fact that fire control systems at the time don't really handle massive course changes very well. So it would be a case of fixing a course, firing for a while on that course, and then fixing another course, not really kind of dodging and weaving unless you don't want to hit anything. Andre de Coult asks, one of the least ever talked about subjects in history is how was toilet usage organised in the period of 1900 through 1950? And more to the point, on-duty personnel, on-watch personnel, people at action stations, but not during combat. Especially when bodily functions became imperative, were they able to temporarily excuse themselves? Did they have to hold on? Did they have to find some method of relieving themselves at their action station, etc.? So as always, practices vary by navy somewhat, but if you are in a situation where you have people on duty, on watch, or action stations, but as you say, not during combat, generally speaking, if you did need to visit the heads, you would be allowed if you requested permission. They tend to be not liberally distributed throughout the ship, but there's usually some within a certain radius of access, for obvious reasons, and most ships' functions have backups and duplicates for a reason. It's not to visit the heads, it's obviously because of combat casualties. So if you have, like you can see here, these are the anti-aircraft gunners aboard HMS Rodney, you don't need to operate that anti-aircraft gun with every single person who's in attendance. You can operate it with several men less, as I said, because it's designed to be able to be operated if you do take a few casualties. So if you're not actively in combat and someone really needs to visit their heads, you can afford to let them go. Obviously, you can't afford to let more than one or two go at any one time, and there would be an expectation, certainly if you're coming onto regular duty or watches, that you would have seen to that before you went on duty. They might be very annoyed if you're on duty for half an hour and they're like, oh, actually, I forgot, so I need to go now. But equally, if you've been locked up at action stations, which obviously would have been an unexpected call for, hours and hours on end, people are going to understand that in most places you do need to go, and therefore you would be allowed to. If you're in a situation where your action stations and enemy contact is considered very imminent, and or you're in an area where it's very heavily locked down, you may not be allowed to go because of the time and the risk of essentially unsealing that position. But in those circumstances, buckets, shell cases, stuff like that would have to come into temporary use. Felicity Longis asks, hey Drac, long-time listener, first-time contributor. In your Congo, is it a battlecruiser or battleship video, you mentioned the Congos being sent out to hunt down von Spee's squadron. First, did they have a realistic chance of engaging the Germans? 2, what would that engagement have looked like? And 3, how would that outcome have impacted the West's view of the Imperial Japanese Navy in subsequent treaties and battle planning? Okay, so did the Congo have a reasonable chance of engaging the Germans? Technically, yes. There was a period in late August and early September 1914, after Japan had declared war on Germany, when Congo was deployed to the Central Pacific to, monitor and try and find German ships and sink them. And both the Japanese and the rest of the Allies were occupied in occupying the various German Pacific colonies, including German Samoa, which you may remember from the big Apia cyclone in the 19th century, which we've done a video on. And as a result, von Spee, when he heard about the fall of that particular colony, actually went over to investigate, but by the time he got there, the Allied warships had moved on. So there was a period of about 3, maybe 4 weeks when the East Asia Squadron was in an area where Congo also roughly was, and therefore potentially, if the relevant people got relevant words around, they could have been engaged. Hiei was technically available, but she spent the time when the East Asia Squadron was actually in the Western Pacific-Central Pacific at Sasebo, so unlikely that Hiei also would have participated. As for what the engagement would have looked like, well, it would have required somebody to go, hey, the Germans are over here, and then Congo and various other Japanese and potentially Allied ships to converge on them. At the time, you do have a number of other fairly heavy Japanese units, including the 12-inch armed armoured cruisers, the Ibukis and the Tsukubas. And most of those are around as well, or available in the area. So exactly what the engagement would have looked like would have depended very much on exactly which Japanese ships could have got to the general area formed up and then obviously engaged von Spee. Now, Congo in and of herself is perfectly a match for any of von Spee's ships. However, there are a lot of them, and so if it had just been Congo in the open seas, then pretty much similar to how Sturdy conducted his battle, she probably would have just stuck at range and pelted Scharnhorst and Organisenau with 14-inch shells. But unlike the Battle of the Falkland Islands, in that circumstance, most of the German East Asia Squadron would have escaped because it would have taken time to knock out one, maybe two, but probably just the one armoured cruiser, and everyone else is running to the wind while this is occurring. However, of course, if the Japanese are able to marshal considerably more vessels, a mixture of light and armoured cruisers and maybe some of those pre-dreadnought battlecruiser types, then it would have been kind of a slight variant on the Battle of the Falkland Islands. Now, the chase might have taken somewhat longer because, of course, at that beginning of the war, von Spee Squadron wasn't having quite the same engine issues as they would be after a long voyage across the Pacific and down and round plus battle. But still, they would have been very much on the back foot and having to withdraw and being chased by the Japanese. So, as I say, some variant on the Falkland Islands. It definitely wouldn't have been an engagement the Germans could have won. And as for how that outcome could have impacted the West's view of the Japanese Navy, well, in the beginning of the First World War, at least the British, the Royal Navy, and its associated forces like the Royal Australian Navy actually had a relatively decent view of the Japanese Navy anyway. Obviously, as things went on and as you get into the Washington Treaty, you have various other more political issues cropping up. But I think if you'd had some kind of Battle of the Falkland Islands, except in the Western Central Pacific where the Japanese Navy had crushed von Spee, I mean, they'd already crushed the Russians 10 years earlier, so that in and of itself as a result wouldn't be too much of a surprise. But if they'd been able to demonstrate that consistently, both in the pre-Dreadnought and the Dreadnought era, I mean, they weren't taken unseriously, but they might be taken even more seriously. I mean, they were, as they seen as a threat anyway. But without the British battle at the Falkland Islands being a victory, you might then see perhaps British battlecruiser efforts judged a little bit more harshly because they wouldn't have any clear decisive victories to point to. Because you'd have, Dogger Bank, sort of qualified. Yes, you managed to sink Blucher, but compared to what you could have done, not great. Obviously, Beatty's run to the south, that's a defeat. And then, there's small actions like, relatively speaking, small actions like Heligan Bight and so forth, but nothing as concrete as this is how you use a battlecruiser, which the Falkland Islands pretty much is. Instead, the Japanese would be the exemplar for that. Ran Parr asks, HMS Dasher, what really happened? Who was responsible? Was it a cover-up or just wartime carry-on attitudes? There certainly was a degree of a cover-up, which I wouldn't say in and of itself necessarily suggests malice or conspiracy. It was more to do with the fact that there was actually a horrifically high loss of life, and the ship exploded pretty much right off UK shore. So spoiler alert, she just exploded and sank on the way home. And that was despite a fairly rapid response by everybody who'd seen the ship explode, trying to go and save people. Part of the problem was it's very cold in the northern waters of the UK, and also the sea was covered with burning petrol or aviation fuel, which really didn't help matters if you were trying to get off the ship, which sank pretty darn quickly. And basically, because of both the horrific nature of a lot of the fatalities and the fact that this escort carrier had just blown up and sunk right there on the UK coast, during wartime, there was a certain level of news suppression going on. But as I said, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily suggest conspiracy, because there was a fair amount of censoring of wartime losses generally anyway. So what is known is she was conducting final air operations before coming into port when there was an initial explosion somewhere in the ship, although exactly where, not necessarily known, but it was quite a sustained explosion, which was then subsequently followed by a much larger explosion, which blew the ship up and sank it in pretty short order. The Admiralty inquiry established a few things afterwards. They established from the survivors that there had been petrol leakage before, and they also established that there were some holes between the area where the aviation fuel was stored and other parts of the ship, including the propulsion, the propeller shaft area. And, of course, the ship's magazines were close by the petrol storage. Because one of the things you've got to remember is that Dasher was not a purpose-built escort carrier. Like most of the early escort carriers, she was a converted merchant hull. So the official verdict was that there had probably been another petrol leak, and fumes had built up, which had been set off by something, electrical sparks, heat, whatever. And that explosion had then set off the magazines, which caused a much bigger secondary explosion, which sank the ship completely. And that was that. Now, as I said, there have been various theories floated at various points as to what really, quote-unquote, caused the accident. But doing a little bit more digging, it turns out that just this earlier petrol leak wasn't the first problem that had been reported with Dasher. She had actually even had hull seams split open while she was in operation, which suggests that perhaps the hull hadn't been converted particularly well, or perhaps the hull was overstressed by a combination of Atlantic conditions and the different loads that were now being put on her. Or maybe the original merchant hull just hadn't been built particularly well. So unlike the more purpose-built escort carriers that come later, where obviously they could plan exactly where the magazines and the fuel storage was all going to be put, in Dasher and sister ships, they were having to essentially just find spaces that they could put things and plumb all these things in after the fact. And even with the later purpose-built ones, they were fairly lightly built. So, US Navy sailors used to joke that CVE meant combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. And certainly the ones that were hit by kamikazes didn't tend to fare that well. Another interesting factor, as you can find in D.K. Brown's book that covers the Second World War, is that despite obviously a lot of the records about Dasher's sinking being classified for some time after the war, one of the things that is directly attributable to the inquiry into the sinking of Dasher is that both British and US escort carriers rather quickly reduced the amount of on-board aviation fuel that they carried, although by differing rates, differing levels, which suggests that someone somewhere in the Navy had come to a conclusion that the amount of fuel being carried was a problem, which, again, is believable if you put large amounts of aviation fuel in essentially jury-rigged containers in a ship that wasn't really designed to hold it. So put all those factors together, and obviously as well, the loss of ships like Lexington and a number of Japanese carriers, and I think the idea that somewhere on the ship there was some kind of leak of aviation fuel, and some operation or just random sparks or whatever happened to set off the vapor that built up as a result, which then set off the magazines, I think is not an implausible conclusion. And given the issues the ship clearly had, you can see how that kind of thing would have come about. Exactly what the source of that ignition is, I don't think we'll ever know, but it was probably something deep in the ship, considering that the first explosion was heard to be internal. Some have suggested maybe an aircraft crash landed and that set it off, but then the first explosion would have been quite dramatically above the ship, for the most part. And, as I say, the cover-up probably came about partly because of the horrific nature of the mass casualty event, and also telling everyone, hey, we accidentally made a poorly constructed floating bomb and there's a whole bunch of them going around. Not the best thing to be advertising in the middle of World War II. And even, as I said, even with the changes that resulted from Dash's sinking, escort carriers were still known for being somewhat explodey when hit. F-19A Ghost Rider asks, I've been reading about the naval side of the US Civil War for the first time, and the description I've read of David Farragut's naval assault up the Mississippi that caused New Orleans to fall kept on bringing one word to my mind, the Dardanelles. I couldn't not think of the parallels between this stunning 1862 attack and what the Royal Navy hoped to achieve in 1915 against the Ottomans. Is there any evidence that the British naval leadership took inspiration from Farragut's assault for the Dardanelles operation? Clearly, the situations are very different, but I wonder if the Royal Navy leadership thought, well, if a small American flotilla could do that, then surely we can punch up to Constantinople. I'm sure that the operation was probably considered in the broader scope of these are naval amphibious assault operations that have previously been conducted and were successful. But in terms of directly taking cues from that attack, I don't think that would have been the case, because in between the American Civil War and 1914-1915, of course, not only had naval technology advanced quite significantly, but there had also been quite a large number of both shore bombardments in close confined waters and amphibious assaults of varying sizes, a lot of which had been done by the Royal Navy, and a few had been done by others. The bombardment of Alexandria, for example, the Boxer Rebellion and the siege of the Taku forts, and all the stuff associated with that. So there were a fair number of other operations that were a lot more proximate and therefore a lot more relevant to consider. There are two other major factors. As I've pointed out in other considerations of the Dardanelles operation, such as the pursuit of Goeben and the video I did on specifically the opening segment of the Gallipoli campaign, the Allied operations against the Ottomans in the Dardanelles seem to basically have been almost a game of two halves, with some additional factors coming in as well. But very early on, they seem to have treated it like a colonial expedition against some, almost unarmed natives, I guess, just on a larger scale. So you even have the sort of, and if you do it again, we'll come back and show you bombardment of the outer forts, which that's the kind of thing you do to someone who probably doesn't have the resources to build up additional fortifications and whose fortifications weren't much of a threat in the first place. Except, of course, with the Ottomans, they went, okay, that bombardment actually did quite a number on our fortifications. That's concerning. I guess we should probably rebuild and upgrade them, which obviously did nobody any favours, well, apart from the Ottomans, once the actual Gallipoli landings got underway. I've pointed out many times before, if the Allied forces hadn't done that, the Ottomans wouldn't have been anywhere near as aware of how vulnerable their fortifications were. And so if the first time Allied capital ships had fired on the Ottoman fortifications had been when they actually tried the landings probably would have been a heck of a lot more successful. I mean, the Germans probably still would have somewhat reinforced and upgraded those fortifications, but the urgency and the clear case in point would not have been there at the time. On top of that, when you have the initial Allied plan, you have this slightly odd thing of, blow your way through the Dardanelles up to Constantinople and point guns at it to make them do what you want, despite the fact the Royal Navy had actually done exactly that back in the Age of Sail, and then not done the actual bombardment bit, which kind of, pulled the teeth out of any potential threat. So all of that is very kind of muddled colonial thinking, which really is pretty terrible decision making. But then when you look at the actual landing preparation, when you get experimental landing craft, the merchant ship that's converted into essentially a mobile fire point, and so on and so forth, that element of the landings actually has a huge amount of forward thinking going on, obviously within the limitations of the time. You've got early use of aircraft carrying vessels rather than aircraft carriers. all of that is actually quite advanced. It just runs afoul of the previous stupidity, which has rendered the target incredibly tough to crack. And then during that operation, you also get a mix of things, because you have people going, hey, this should work really well. Like Cunningham going, hey, we've got a whole flotilla of destroyers fitted up with minesweeping gear. And then someone going, no, we're going to use these decrepit, mostly civilian manned trawlers instead. That seems like a brilliant plan. I mean, honestly, if you teleported me back in time to the start of World War I and put me in charge of operations in the Eastern Mediterranean, I'm pretty sure just by not doing a couple of things that the Allied commanders did and actually doing some of the more sensible things, like using resources already there, simply by just changing those things, not really actually changing all that much about what resources are available, I probably could have won that campaign. Reichspear Minister asks, what was the Japanese Navy doing in January of 1916? The short answer is not a huge amount, actually. In 1914 and early 1915, there'd been a bit of excitement, possibly the East Asia Squadron was around, so they'd gone looking for them. They'd grabbed a whole bunch of German colonies, but then that had kind of calmed down, partly because Australia and New Zealand had gotten a little twitchy about Japan expanding its holdings all across the Pacific, and partly because they were also running out of German colonies. And at that point, there wasn't really any wider commitment for the Japanese to go and do other stuff in the European theatre, so they didn't. And in fact, there would be a little bit of negotiation going on before Japan dispatched the 1st and 2nd Special Service Squadrons to further assist Allied efforts in 1917, the year after this question. There was also, at the beginning of the war, some Japanese escort assistance for the Anzac troop convoys and so forth. But 1916, they were mostly concerned with minor refits to some of the Congo class, getting some of the Fusos and Iseis either on trials or under construction, depending on the ship in question. There seems to have been some patrols up and down the Chinese coast, but 1916, especially early 1916, was a pretty quiet period for the Japanese Navy. They were essentially just looking over what they'd newly acquired and sorting out patrol routes and that kind of stuff. Lord Drucken asks, how reliant were German land forces in North Africa on Italian naval support and convoys during World War II? I imagine getting any kind of German naval support past either Gibraltar or Malta and into the Mediterranean would have been rather difficult, if not outright impossible, even after the fall of France opening up the French Mediterranean ports. The short answer is they were pretty much entirely dependent on Italian naval support and convoys during the Second World War. There was obviously a somewhat lack of German merchant shipping in the Mediterranean. There was also no German surface naval support because the Regia Marina never got a surface ship through the Straits of Gibraltar. There was a few small coastal vessels and light vessels that the Germans had acquired through various means or transported or built, but nothing that's really going to be worth mentioning in terms of going from Italy to North Africa in a convoy route. You've also got the fact that obviously the Italians do have a fair number of merchant ships and naval craft, and they are trying to support their armies, so they're already doing it. There are, of course, German U-boats, but U-boats are not good cargo carriers, so they're not transporting supplies via U-boat to the Africa Corps. And, there were attempts by the Germans to transport some of their supplies by air, courtesy of the Luftwaffe, like this thing, the motorized version of the Gigant or Gigant. That didn't work very well, let's just say. It turns out slow transports without much in the way of escort and bow fighters do not make a good mix, especially when, like this particular example was full of fuel, and you can imagine what happened when the bow fighters hit it with incendiary rounds. Chris Knight asks, why did the Japanese Navy go with two different 5-inch guns, a 5-inch 50 caliber for destroyers and a 5-inch 40 caliber on heavier units, instead of just adopting a single 5-inch gun like the US Navy did? It was a mixture of technology, priorities, and luck. Because you've got to remember, the US was going to go with a split 5-inch battery for a good long while. They're going to have 5-inch 51 caliber anti-surface weapons and 5-inch 25 anti-air weapons. And there was some consideration to, when they were looking at new destroyers, to just equipping them with 5-inch 25s and accepting a pretty terrible anti-surface performance comparatively, until someone luckily invented the 5-inch 38, which kind of split down the middle. With the Japanese, and then, like with the British, choosing with the 5.25-inch and the 4.7-inch and the 4.5-inch and this kind of thing. With the Japanese destroyers, the Japanese chose a 5-inch gun that was a good anti-surface weapon, which had secondarily dual-purpose characteristics, as opposed to the US, who went with a 5-inch 38 with a gun that was almost spot on in the middle between AA and ASW and anti-surface. But if you had to say which side of that equation it might just about have edged towards, it would be maybe edging us slightly towards anti-aircraft. The thing with the 5-inch 40 caliber, which was the secondary gun on the cruisers, battleships, etc., this was a dedicated anti-aircraft weapon. It was, being a shorter caliber, somewhat lighter, somewhat easier to maneuver, and could therefore be done at a higher elevation without putting massive weight penalties on. So it had the properties of a reasonable anti-aircraft weapon. However, one of the things that it compromised on was muzzle velocity and therefore range. So it had about 4,000 yards less range at a 45-degree elevation compared to a 5-inch 50 caliber gun. And therefore, obviously, it would also not only not be able to engage at longer distances, but at shorter distances, it wouldn't hit as hard and it wouldn't have as flat a trajectory or as shorter flight time, which obviously those things can make all the difference in close-range destroyer engagements. Whereas, obviously, for the larger ships, those guns were primarily there to shoot at aircraft and only secondarily engage surface targets. And so for the Japanese way of thinking and their doctrine, it made sense. You give the destroyers the slightly heavier, flatter trajectory firing, longer range guns, which will be more useful in surface engagements, and you give the ships the more anti-aircraft optimized weapons. Now, interestingly enough, in case you're wondering, in terms of muzzle velocity and range, the 5-inch 38 falls performance-wise almost exactly between the 5-inch 40 and the 5-inch 50 in the Imperial Japanese Navy. So could the Japanese have potentially invented a 5-inch 45 with similar performance to a 5-inch 38 in the US? Possibly, but they seem to have locked in on these, having a somewhat greater advantage for their destroyers in surface combat, and that was pretty much that. Smelly Kaka asks, the world wonders, what do you think of the chances that this padding might have been seen as an insult by a radio operator who then deliberately left it in when received, and possibly one who deliberately chose it when sending? Whether this happened or not, are there known cases of radio operators or signalmen doing something like this for fun or malice? There are plenty of examples of radiomen using either directly carefully chosen words or plays on words and things like this to imply certain things, either as jokes, pranks, or indeed to insult people. And there's a huge long list of that kind of stuff. It's one of the favourite habits of radiomen, certainly in that period, possibly even today. But in terms of the world wonders, so that is the message that was sent to Halsey, basically saying, where the heck is Task Force 34, which ostensibly was bracketed at the front and back end by nonsense phrases, the one at the front being Turkey trots to water. Now, ostensibly, these were chosen kind of at random in keeping with standard US protocols at the time. I think that you can make an argument for it just being an unfortunate choice at the tail end of things, because Turkey trots to water clearly has very little to do with naval operations, so it's obviously a padding phrase. Whereas saying, where is Task Force 34, the world wonders, that sounds like it's part of a continuous inquiry with, an appellative at the end. So at that point, you can make an argument, which I think is the official argument, that, well, it was just, this is what was going to be sent, and it was just an unfortunate coincidence. In terms of the radio operator who sent it, I don't think they would have deliberately put it in there as an insult. For one thing, obviously, the radio operator is not necessarily going to have an entirely clear idea of what the overall tactical situation is as a whole. So then they're going to be receiving and decoding some messages, but compared to the admirals and captains, they're not going to really know what's going on. So there's no point in specifically insulting Halsey over something that you probably don't necessarily know about all that much. Conversely, the radio operator on Halsey's flagship would have been receiving all the various specific requests and transmissions to him at the time, including various people who, were making inquiries even as his fleet was sailing north to engage the Japanese Northern Force. So while it is still relatively unlikely, I think between the sending radio man and the receiving radio man, plus the potential to pass it off as, oh, well, it looked like it was part of the inquiry, sir, I think there is a slightly greater possibility that perhaps the radio man on Halsey's flagship was a little bit ticked off with his boss at this point, because he would have had an idea that everyone was saying, hey, we should probably do something about this. And then you get this signal going, hey, where is the task force? I can see a radio man then going, yeah, you know what? I'm going to leave that in. I think we need to see what happens. The Past is Another Country asks, the Alaskas were a class of ships whose service life is better measured in months rather than years, and they didn't engage in any major surface actions. However, they seem to hold people's attention. You've got 2 longer videos on them, as well as regular Drydock questions, including the previous one from me. What is it about the Alaskas that holds people's curiosity? Are there any other ships or classes that you think get more attention than their service would suggest? Oh, ships that get more attention than their service would suggest. Everybody say it with me. 3, 2, 1. Bismarck! And, well, Tirpitz as well. Yeah, you saw that one coming. Anyway, with the Alaskas and a few other ships, obviously including Bismarck, potentially also the Yamatos, considering that they really didn't do all that much other than act as XP pinatas for the US Navy. But with the Alaskas, I think they offer a little unique thing that the US Navy doesn't otherwise possess. And they occupy this little space which generates a huge amount of debate. Because, let's face it, the US has a lot of cruisers. The US has a lot of destroyers. The US builds a lot of submarines. The US builds a lot of battleships. And there's more people obviously have their favourites. There's not really a huge amount of controversy around those ships and what they are and what they're for and this kind of thing. At most, there's the kind of mostly friendly on-again, off-again debate as to whether the Iowas are technically battle cruisers or not. And as I pointed out in the past, it's like, by some metrics, yes, you could technically argue the Iowas are battle cruisers, but more realistically, they're fast battleships. But with the Alaskas, you have a much stronger argument for them being battle cruisers, although, as I've covered in my videos, I think they're more super cruiser than battle cruiser. But there is this very grey line because, again, without belaboring my previous video, essentially, by construction principles, they are super cruisers, but by their direct mission role, they are almost exactly the original battle cruiser mission. And that's, I think, mostly where the sort of controversy comes from. And that's coupled with the fact that whether they be super cruiser or battle cruiser, they're not a type the US Navy actually built and commissioned before. People look at the Lexingtons occasionally, and, well, even with the Lexingtons, there's this weird argument about, oh, the US Navy called them scout cruisers, so they're not actually battle cruisers. Like, go home, they are battle cruisers. In actual fact, someone has very recently kindly sent me a book, which is the detailed specifications for battle cruisers for the United States Navy, which is an officially issued book from the Navy Department Bureau of Construction and Repair, which is sent to the shipyards to tell them how to build the battlecruisers, and it even says on the cover, numbers 1 through 6, Lexington, Constellation, Saratoga, Ranger, Constitution in the United States. So, yeah, the Lexingtons are battlecruisers. Stop whining about it, people who think they're scout cruisers. Anyway, you also get, I think, and also the people who argue the Lexingtons and scout cruisers are probably the same group, people who argue, oh, well, you know, the United States never wanted battlecruisers, and as I pointed out before, again, yeah, they did. There's a very long list of US battlecruiser designs going all the way back to pretty much the instant that battlecruisers became a thing. Just Congress wouldn't fund them. So for the people who are, say, shall we say, a little bit more ignorant of what the US Navy and Navy's relationship with battlecruisers is, they see the Alaskas as, why did the US Navy build this? This is really weird and potentially interesting. And for the people who are perhaps more informed about the US Navy's interest in battlecruisers going back through history, although they're not necessarily in and of themselves quite battlecruisers, they're the closest the US Navy ever actually gets in terms of ships being commissioned. And then, you know, they kind of also look a little bit like mini Iowas. And then they're here, and then they're gone, and I think that also engenders a little bit of interest as well. So it's kind of, you know, the interest you get on something that is a little bit unique and a little bit controversial, especially in a navy that more generally tended to build large amounts of things and then keep them for very long periods of time. The Alaskas are kind of the opposite of that. Lord Nelson asks, how did the ships of Hood's fleet help the Allied ground forces during the defence of Toulon? So for those of you wondering what this is the, otherwise known as the Siege of Toulon in 1793, where you have a coalition of forces, including Britain, trying to restore the French royalist faction to power in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Spoiler alert, it does not go well. So for the actual siege of Toulon, in terms of the ground operations, obviously there were quite a few French royalist troops and a bunch of other troops from the coalition who were obviously dedicated land troops. But the Royal Navy did land, depending on your source, between 1,500 and 1,700 men to assist with the defence. It seems that the lower end figures count just the Royal Marines, whereas the higher figures include sailors as well. But and there's some sources that also say it's 200. The 200 difference is the Royal Marines and the sailors, and the 1,500 are other troops. But other people say the 1,500 are Royal Marines from across the fleet. So yeah, the Royal Navy lands a decent number of men, basically. This force initially occupied a fort, but it was also led by Captain Elphinston, or Royal Navy, and along with other Allied troops, they actually went and defeated a revolutionary-republican vanguard, which was heading to Toulon. Some of the Royal Navy ships and also supplied counter-battery fire against the Republican guns, and the Royal Navy also improvised a number of floating gun batteries, so there was direct fire support. And then, of course, as the situation devolved and eventually an evacuation would have to be called, the Royal Navy was key in basically taking what was worthwhile and could be moved, evacuating as many men from the coalition army as possible, and then also obviously setting fire to any French warships still in Toulon that couldn't be withdrawn as well. Herr Fuschwansager asks, okay, a bit of an odd one, but how do anchors for large ships actually work? According to a video by Battleship Iowa, the anchors on the ship weigh 30,000 pounds, about 14 tons, with chain links of 128 pounds, or about 55 kilos each. How do you prevent a 45,000 ton ship from just dragging that thing wherever it wants? So there is a bit of a transition point, because if you've got a small craft, like a riverboat or something like that, and you put an anchor down, then the anchor is pretty much directly holding you to the bottom. However, once you get to a ship of any appreciable size, including pretty much any warship worth the name, it's not a case of, you know, the anchor hits the bottom, anchor digs in, and that's it. Because as you say, if it's just the anchor, then the mass of the anchor and the chain isn't anywhere close to that of the ship. So if the ship starts to move, the anchor's just coming with you, and it doesn't have anywhere near enough grabbing power to hold the ship in place. And if it somehow has been completely wedged in something, then, well, the anchor chain's just going to snap. So for large ships, including, I say, pretty much all warships, the way the anchor works is that, let's say you're anchoring in 100 feet of water, you wouldn't let out 100 feet of chain. You'd let out 300, 400, 500 feet of chain, or possibly more. And this is why when you see ships actually anchor in places where they need the anchor as anything more than just a kind of a placeholder to keep them roughly in position, i.e. anywhere where wind and water and current might actually shove them around, the anchor chains are not dropping vertically, they're dropping outwards at an angle. And that's because you'll have, yes, a certain amount of anchor chain running from the surface to the seabed, but the vast majority of the anchor chain and the anchor itself will be lying flat on the seabed. The anchor itself will obviously dig in, but what's actually stopping the ship from moving at that point is more so the friction that all of that chain and anchor is having with the seabed. So obviously if the anchor digs in, if you've got a sandy or muddy bottom, all the better, but you can actually anchor on fairly rocky ground as well, where the anchor isn't necessarily going to dig in. But again, it's down to mostly the friction of all that metal. And you can experience this on a much smaller scale if perhaps you have a particularly long length of garden hose. Now, if you have that garden hose all on a reel, it's very easy to pick up with one hand and cart around almost without much thought. But if that entire length of hose is out on the lawn, maybe 30, 40, 50 feet of the stuff, and you're trying to reel it back in or you're trying to haul it around, even though grass is relatively slippy and the plastic of a hose is relatively slippy, and compared to anchor chain doesn't have anything like as much surface area, you'll find you have to put in a huge amount more effort to drag that hose around, despite the fact the hose weighs exactly the same, than you would if you were carrying it around on a reel because of friction. And obviously if you happen to have 20 or 30 feet of chain for whatever reason, you can more closely experience it by putting that out and comparing how much effort you have to put to carrying it around in a bundle as opposed to hauling it around on the ground. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, can you describe what the Regia Marina was up to in the Far East in terms of operations and what battles they participated in? I know there are a few submarines that were out there, but I'm not aware of anything else. So, for the most part, yeah, it was submarines, and even then not for too long, because most of the Italian submarines in the East African section of the Italian Empire tried to get back round to the main area of operations. Later on, the Regia Marina would send a couple of submarines all the way over to the Japanese in the Pacific, but not much other than that for submarine activity. There were some Italian submarine patrols in the Indian Ocean, but yeah, if you know about the Regia Marina's submarine activities in the Indian Ocean and technically in the Japanese area of the Pacific, then you already know about those. But outside of that, at the start of hostilities for Italy, there was the Red Sea flotilla, obviously, shockingly enough, based in and around the Red Sea. And they had some submarines, but they also had some small Mars boats and some destroyers. But the Italian destroyers did their best to try and attack various Allied convoys in the area. An attack on convoy BN7 resulted in minor damage to both sides, but then the Italian destroyer Francesco Nullo was attacked and destroyed by HMS Kimberley in the aftermath as Kimberley was pursuing. They tried a few other convoy attacks. Those weren't particularly successful. They also tried to build their own version of a Hilfskreuzer, or an armed merchant raider, the Ram 1. But the cruiser Leander, which had seen off the attack on convoy BN7, found it and sank it pretty quickly. The British made a few air attacks against the Italian fleet base, caused a little bit of damage here and there, but the Italians were also steadily losing destroyers. One ran aground and had to be scuttled. A torpedo boat had to be scuttled because it was basically irreparable. Then British carrier aircraft, although at that point flying out from an airfield, managed to find and sink more of the Italian surface ships while they were away from port, and the remaining ones were scuttled because it was clear that there basically wasn't any further point. They were just going to get sunk anyway. And then in April 1941, the British invaded and captured the port, so the last few ships and submarines either made a break for it or were destroyed, either by their own crews or in action, although they did manage to torpedo and therefore damage the cruiser Cape Town as kind of a last act. And that brings us to an end of this week's Dry Dock. Thank you very much for listening. I think this is probably the longest of the split form Dry Dock, since this one's overrun by about 40 minutes. Let's see if we actually manage to get all the questions in the video description. But other than that, thanks for listening, and see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.